Suddenly, someone walked up, and the 7th grade students instinctively stepped aside. Everyone stared at Shiron, who had just arrived. He looked up at the notice board and said, "Teleportation, huh?" After class, the advanced class notice board was buzzing with chatter. Did that really happen? Wow. Bullying? How sad. He's only in 7th grade. Is it because he doesn't know how to use magic yet? 7th graders haven't learned magic, so what does that have to do with anything? Someone explained the reason clearly. It's obviously jealousy. He's dating Amy, after all. Amy stood in front of the notice board looking confused. So, he's being bullied? Then she realized that's why he's been avoiding me. He doesn't want me to get caught up in this, does he? Sherelle, standing next to Amy, explained, well, the mental power of 7th graders is still pretty weak, so this kind of thing happening is normal. I've gone through something similar before, but getting promoted early isn't such a big deal, right? Suddenly, Amy turned around and walked off. Sherelle called out, "Where are you going?" Amy answered, "To see Chiron." Sherelle said, "What? Hold on. What are you planning to do?" Amy snapped, "I'm going to teach him a lesson. He hid this from me. I'm going to round up those jerks in 7th grade." Sherelle hurried after her. "Are you crazy?" "No way." Amy stormed ahead. "Why not? I'm involved in this too." Sherelle, still being dragged along, tried to reason with her. "If it were you, would you want the person you'd like to get caught up in a bullying situation?" Sherelle shouted, "If you go there, things will get even worse." Amy muttered to herself, "So stupid, so stupid." She thought, "So that's what it is? Ridiculous. I'm not even the one he likes. Then why the heck is he hiding this from me?" Sherelle said, "Anyway, teleportation is just too difficult for a 7th grader." Amy frowned. "If it's that hard, then that's good. For someone who's never learned magic, trying teleportation is way too dangerous." Sherelle suggested, "Amy, why would you teach him? Doesn't that make more sense?" Amy snapped, "Why should I help that kid? Plus, I'm studying for the upcoming exam. I've got no time to deal with that." Sherelle nodded. "You're right, I forgot. Sorry." Amy yelled, "If he can't even handle something like this on his own, he doesn't deserve to be my boyfriend." Later that night at the academy, something appeared on the trees. Someone was moving at incredible speed. A figure landed, and someone muttered, "This definitely doesn't mean anything else." Amy, wearing a cloak, sat on a tree, grumbling to herself, "I'm only helping him because it's my responsibility." In the blink of an eye, she disappeared. Amy kicked her legs a few times and flew toward Chiron's room. "First, I need to make him beg me for help." Amy landed on the window of Chiron's room, startling him. "Who?" Chiron yelled loudly. "Who's there?" Before he could finish, she covered his mouth. Amy said, "I'm here to teach you a lesson." Amy smiled brightly. "How dare you do that to me?" Then she froze, staring. Inside Chiron's room, Sana was sitting there. Sana adjusted her glasses. "Are you Amy?" she asked. "Wait, it's so late, and we're meeting here. And you even snuck into the men's dorm at night?" Amy quickly waved her hands. "It's a misunderstanding, really. A huge misunderstanding." Sana quickly said, "Quiet. The neighbors are coming over now. Let's go inside first." Sana covered her mouth. "It's been a while since we last met, and now you're being this bold." Amy stammered, "This is my first time here. Chiron thought he might get in trouble if he saw me, so I snuck over." Then Amy suddenly remembered to ask Sana, "But from what you said, why are you still here this late?" Sana replied, "I came to give him some advice about the promotion exam. The classroom atmosphere is really chaotic right now." Amy nodded. "I see." Chiron handed Amy some tea. "Senior, drink some tea." "Thanks. It smells really good. Where did you learn to make tea?" While they were talking, Amy suddenly jumped, feeling like she wanted to hit Chiron. "This isn't right. That damn kid, why do I have to endure this humiliation for him?" Chiron quickly shouted, "I'm sorry." Amy's voice echoed through the entire dorm building. "By the way, why didn't you tell me you were being bullied?" Saya quietly called out, "Hey, you two, can you sit down for a second? Let me finish talking about the promotion exam first." Chiron took a sip of tea and thought, how did things end up like this? He looked at himself and Amy sitting across from Sana, letting out a helpless sigh. "This is ridiculous." Amy said, "Isn't this teleportation exam a bit dangerous? Chiron hasn't even learned any magic right." Sana replied, "The principal gave a direct order on this. I'm worried too, but clearly he must have a reason for doing it." Amy thought to herself, no wonder it's one of the principal's games. Chiron asked Amy, "Is it really that dangerous?" Amy nodded. "Of course. You know, teleportation magic uses the light attribute, right?" Chiron answered, "Yeah, I've heard of the theory of photon magic." Amy explained to him that light has something called an absolute speed. They say that nothing in this world can surpass the speed of light. She went on to explain how magic works. "Teleportation is a spell that uses that speed to move through time and space," Amy explained. Shiron said, by transforming the body into light. Sana, sitting next to her, added, it sounds complicated, but actually, teleportation isn't that hard. Even beginners can do it easily, so just try it. The required speed for teleportation is close to the speed of light. That's because it's a spell we can use even if we only understand 1,000th of the speed of light. Sina's voice was calm. However, because of that, the level of light conversion is reduced and the remaining body mass is very small. Shiron thought for a moment. So, while it's easy to learn, it's very dangerous if something goes wrong, kind of like the speed of sound. He looked up at Sana and said, do you understand now why teleportation is a banned spell in the curriculum? Sana smiled. You really catch on quickly. Amy, sitting beside them, glanced over. She thought to herself, when did those two get so close? They're totally ignoring me. I've never seen Sana act this friendly with anyone. Shiron asked, so how do we pass this dangerous magic test? Sana replied, well, Amy cleared her throat and said, you should practice it somewhere without any obstacles. Shiron stared off, is there such a place? Amy raised a finger, there is. Shiron looked up at the ceiling above. Then he suddenly realized, could it be in the sky? The horizon boundary, the teleportation practice field, 1,000 meters high, 700 meters long. Sana answered, it's not officially certified yet, but honestly, there's nowhere else but there. She mentioned the mountaintop and continued, the test rules are to race from the peak of one mountain to the peak of another. Shiron gasped, that sounds amazing. There aren't any obstacles up there. He smiled and added, so if you fall, you die, right? Amy asked Sana, but it's a race where the first one to reach the finish line wins, right? Don't you think that's a bit too tough for a 7th grade level? Sana's expression grew serious. If no one finishes, the student who teleports the farthest will win. Of course, the difficulty of the exam will be set at level 1 and safety equipment will be provided to minimize the risk. She was silent for a moment before continuing. What I'm worried about are the students. If the competition becomes too fierce, there will be conflicts. Amy glanced at Shiron. In that case, it's obviously Shiron. Sana added to what Amy said, she will become the target of competition for the kids. Shiron quietly thought to herself, can I handle this? If it's just a puff test, that's fine. But she remembered the malicious glares people had given her. I don't like the idea of having to face the whole class alone. I hate being hurt by the ruthless nature of competition. Shiron wondered, should I even take this test? At that moment, Sana spoke again. I'm sorry, Shiron. She looked at her. I tried to place you in the 5th grade class after the entrance exam when you first enrolled. It seems my greed has caused you trouble. Shiron quickly responded, no, please don't say that. Sana lowered her head. From today, I'll take responsibility for teaching you. Amy, sitting next to them, stayed quiet. After a long pause, she finally looked up, her expression dark as she looked at Sana. Why do you have to go this far? Sana met Amy's gaze. I just feel responsible for the unprecedented difficulty of this promotion exam. I'll do everything I can to help. Amy patted her chest and said, no, that's not it. That could make things worse. Rumors would spread that the teacher acting as the judge in the promotion exam is biased towards Shiron. Even if Shiron passes the exam, the results would be canceled. She looked confidently at Sana and said, let me take care of Shiron. If it's just a level 1 difficulty, there shouldn't be any problem, right? I can teach him. Shiron stared blankly at Amy. Senior Amy, isn't she angry at me? Sana adjusted her glasses and replied, that's true. But Amy, you? Sana turned to Amy and asked, you know I've submitted my graduation promotion application. Do you think you're capable of taking care of Shiron? Shiron jumped in shock. He turned to look at Amy sitting beside him, his eyes wide in disbelief. Graduation class? He thought. Oh my God, graduation class means... The graduation class is the dream of every student at the Magic Academy to become a professional mage. There, the abilities of the graduation class are recognized at a near-professional level. If someone becomes a student about to graduate from a prestigious school, it would be written up in a special article in the Kingdom's Magic Academy magazine. But once you step onto that path, your happy school life will be over. What awaits you is a terrifying and hellish training ahead. Level up application form. Test So 1 for Karma's Amy has been submitted. Amy will be the first to step foot at such a place. Shiron leaned in and asked Amy, how can this be? Isn't it too soon for someone our age? Amy avoided eye contact and looked away. About that, tears welled up in Amy's eyes as she thought to herself, this is all your fault, you damn kid. She thought about how Shiron was about to jump 2 levels at once. This kid was progressing way too fast. The only place she could escape to now was the hellish graduation class. Amy quickly ran off toward the graduation class. Don't come here. Shiron looked at Amy with big puppy dog eyes. She's so cool. I can't even dream of aiming for first place in the advanced class. And yet she's confident enough to be the first to apply for a place so far out of reach. Shiron stayed quiet, watching Amy talk to Saina. He thought even in such an important moment, she's still here helping me. Meanwhile, Amy was laughing and chatting with Saina. No matter how busy you are, is there anything you can't do well? Just give up. Saina replied with a smile. I understand how you feel about your boyfriend, but at a time like this, it's better to leave it to the teacher. Saina said this because it was Shiron's first time learning magic, so having a teacher guide him would be more effective. That comment only fueled Amy's competitive spirit even more. She quickly turned to Shiron and said, well then, Shiron, you decide. Me or Saina? Shiron, feeling tense, replied, I'll choose myself. Amy asked, wouldn't you prefer to have your girlfriend teach you? Wouldn't that be better? Shiron smiled a little and said, no, I can do it myself. This time, both Saina and Amy were left speechless. What? A loud scream echoed through the dorm. What? Amy shouted at Shiron. Are you crazy? Do you have any idea how rare this opportunity is? Shiron twisted his hands together as he answered. I don't want to bother the teacher on the judging panel. Plus, the senior still has an important exam coming up. Amy raised her voice. Other people would be willing to pay tons of money to hire a tutor. And didn't you hear? You're the one everyone in class is competing for. Amy added, this isn't something you can handle by yourself. Shiron lowered his head. Isn't that the reason the senior is pushing for an early graduation? If I keep hesitating, I won't be able to move up to a higher position. Amy was taken aback by Shiron's words. Shiron continued, for me, being in 5th grade is just a step in becoming a mage, just like the senior did. Amy covered her mouth and coughed. Shiron said to Amy, trust me, senior, even though I can't say for sure that I'll pass the test, I'll try my best and won't have any regrets. Saina quietly listened to their conversation. Once Shiron finished speaking, she stood up. I understand. If that's what the student wants, then as a teacher, I have to accept it. Saina said her goodbyes. I won't stay any longer, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask. The same goes for the other students. Shiron stood up and bowed, thanking her. Thank you so much for caring about me, Miss Saina. Saina continued, you all can stay and discuss your ideas more. And Amy, you? Saina walked toward the door, then turned to look at Amy, saying, forget about today. What if you ever climb through the boys' dorm window again, you understand, right? Amy lowered her head. Yes, ma'am. Her soul screamed, I'm alive. Once Saina left, Amy collapsed, letting out a deep breath. That was close. As she relaxed, she suddenly jolted. She quickly stood up and said, I'm leaving now. Shiron also bowed to Amy, saying, yes, I shouldn't have made you come all the way here. Shiron sincerely said, thank you so much, senior. Amy suddenly asked, hey, tell me the truth. Why have you been avoiding me? Shiron froze. Amy continued, you could have told me from the start that you were being bullied. It's not something that's just your responsibility. Amy turned around. Could it be? She remembered what Sherelle had said. If the person you like sees something like that, they would feel their self-esteem take a deep hit. Amy stammered, their self-esteem would be hurt. Shiron responded, it's not that I want to avoid you, senior. Amy covered her mouth in shock. So it's true, really true. Shiron went on, if you're wondering why, it's because you're my goal. Amy paused, looking bored. I knew it, I could tell. Shiron scratched her face. Actually, from the first time I came to school, I saw your name at the top. Shiron remembered when she first came to school and saw Amy's name on the honor roll. She said, at that moment, I thought to myself, I want to work hard and be like senior. On the 4th grade honor roll, 42 people had first place written next to their names, Karmas Amy. Shiron smiled and said, but back then, I never imagined things would turn out like this. It's so awkward. If I told you I was being bullied, it might make everything even more awkward. Amy scoffed, target, huh? She muttered to herself, damn it, I got beaten by a kid. Amy recalled that, back then, if her father knew anyone at the magic school, he would introduce them to her. She coldly glanced at Shiron, thinking how ridiculous this connection was. Amy asked softly, are you kidding? Shiron looked confused. Huh? Amy shouted, target my ass? This is laughable. She stormed up to Shiron. In front of me, you act all friendly, calling me senior here and there, but behind my back, you're secretly trying to catch up to me. Shiron raised his hands in confusion. How did it end up like that? He sighed. Why did it turn out this way? Amy pushed the door open. If you plan to pass me. She put on her cloak, turned, and said, then don't call me senior anymore. Shiron stood frozen. Amy shouted, compete with me fairly. Let's see if you can. She climbed out of the window. You better catch up soon, or I'll make you call me senior for life. Suddenly, Shiron spoke up, Amy. Amy was shocked and flustered. You're calling me by my first name? Shiron said, wait a minute. He stood seriously in the room, looking straight at Amy. I'll definitely catch up to you. Amy laughed, her face shadowed with a deadly aura. You think you can catch up to me with that attitude? She turned around to face Chiron, then flew out the window. I just hope I haven't graduated by then. Chiron clung to the window, watching her disappear in an instant. He let out a deep sigh. I turned down all the help, but I'm sure the people who are targeting me are keeping a close eye on every move I make. His eyes showed determination. Looks like I'll have to rely on my own 2 feet. There was 1 month left before the upcoming promotion exam. The countdown had begun. The next day after class, everyone was talking excitedly. Are you preparing for the promotion exam? The students chatted among themselves. I just hired a tutor today. I have to study simultaneous translation for a whole month. It's going to be tough. Still, there are 20 people signed up for the exam. In theory, it was easy. If you applied the formula, it wasn't that hard. A group of 7th grade boys were talking to each other. The problem is how well you can apply it. One of the boys with green hair pointed towards Chiron, who was walking down the street carrying a pile of books. Is that kid taking the exam too? A stack of books fell, and the cover of one book showed the words optical theory. Chiron thought to himself, I said I'd do this on my own, but looking at the pile of theoretical books in front of him, he sighed. The real problem is the application. In reality, the environment a mage faces is always changing, especially when it comes to teleportation magic. Information about the terrain is crucial, and depending on the situation, we may need to adjust the level of power and light. Chiron sat there, taking notes. Just the units of measurement alone had already reached the 20th power of 10. How could humans possibly calculate something like that? He slapped his forehead and muttered, No, don't give up. There's no reason they'd create an impossible test. He thought for a moment. Sena had once told him that learning teleportation wasn't all that complicated. But what if that didn't apply to someone like him, who had never studied magic before? Chiron remembered what Sena had said. The 7th graders will definitely succeed because they've been taught since they were young and they can easily hire expensive tutors. He felt like an outsider watching them from the sidelines. Sena had asked him, Do you think you can close that gap? Suddenly, Chiron snapped out of his thoughts. Alpheus was smiling at him. On the other side, someone clapped and praised him. Great job. The person looked at the tall figure through the misty smoke and added, You executed the teleportation perfectly, just as expected from the son of Mr. Slider, the technical advisor of the Magic Association. The person addressed the young man Mark. His name was Slider Mark, 15 years old, in 7th grade. He stood up straight and said, It was nothing. I'm just being taught by a level 9 certified teacher. The other man handed him a towel to wipe his face. Mark said, I was a bit worried, but it was actually pretty easy. The man explained, since the test was fairly simple, you could focus and make your choices. His voice was steady as he continued, while it's impossible to fully master teleportation in a month, if we just speed up learning the essential parts for the test and dedicate the rest of the time to practice, there's a good chance we can pass it. Mark smiled proudly. Maybe I should thank that special jerk after all, he said, wiping the sweat off his face. Thanks to him, I leveled up 2 ranks in a short time. Mark took a drink of water and turned to ask the man, By the way, what's that jerk up to now? The man replied, As per the young master's instructions, I've been keeping an eye on him, but it seems like he's just studying on his own and reading books. Mark looked confused. Learning on his own with books? He sounded doubtful. Really? I thought with that kind of money he'd be hiring a top-tier tutor. Something doesn't seem right, does it? Mark gave the order, Keep watching him. He's not the type to be careless. His voice was steady. Just reading a few books is not enough to use magic. Over here, Chiron was fully immersed in numerous books. He set his pen down and took a break. I've done everything I can. First, I spent a lot of time understanding light. I've memorized the theory without making a single mistake. I'm not sure if there's not much time left. The training field number 41 of Class 7 was dimly lit with only a couple of lights glowing faintly as it was night. Chiron stood below, warming up. Now I have to cast the magic. There's nothing impossible. All I can do is hope it works like I expect. Chiron's eyes glowed with a deep blue. First, he opened the domain between his forehead. He immediately began to glow as he spoke, applying the theory of photomancy. Chiron focused hard to maintain his concentration. I am at the boundary between omnipotence and omniscience. The light grew more intense. Chiron was almost surrounded by the deep blue at the word I at its center. Erase it. Suddenly, Chiron's body shone bright yellow. He looked at himself in joy. Okay, it's working, Chiron shouted. Now teleport. His eyes widened, unable to calculate the amount of light. Chiron recalled the teachings he had received. When a mage concentrates, their mind becomes sharp enough to sense everything around them. It's said that exceptional mages can even count the number of leaves from a great distance. Some even place small coins in their hands and explain, this is called an extreme state of mental sensitivity or the domain. Alpheus raised his hand and said, at that point, the mage will be able to perceive the outside world in a supernatural way, which allows them to control phenomena. In front of Chiron, it felt like a whole new world was unfolding. It wasn't about counting numbers anymore. It was about truly sensing everything around him. As time passed, the days slowly ticked away. There were only 13 days left until the teleportation exam. With 9 days remaining, someone inside the academy asked, "What the heck is that?" Everyone turned to look toward the back of the classroom. His face, someone whispered. A girl with short hair and pink locks, who always seemed irritated, shifted her focus to the back of the room. A voice rang out, "He trained without any protection. There's no way." All eyes were on Chiron, whose face was covered in bandages. He was focused on writing notes, his mind deep in thought. My first attempt at teleportation failed. Chiron felt a bit helpless. To fix my mistake, I have no choice but to keep practicing. He kept falling over, hitting the ground again and again. He lay there, hugging his knees. This time, I messed up my knee. With 8 days left, Chiron's notebook was filled with scribbled notes. He remained focused, calculating. Did I make a mistake of 0.02 microseconds? 7 days left. That's a foolish method. But there are 6 days left. At night, the sound of constant impacts fills the training ground. 5 days left. Chiron is still falling. 4 days left. He made up his mind one more time. His body will remember it like an instinct. 3 days left, then 2 days, and with just 1 day remaining, 1. Chiron stood under the lights, supporting himself on his knees, gasping for air. Sweat dripped from his face onto the ground. What should I do? The test is tomorrow. But every time I fix one mistake, another one shows up. He wiped his face, thinking there's nothing left to fix. I have to do this, I have to. Chiron stayed silent, breathing deeply, and the space in front of him started to blur. He slapped his face lightly to wake himself up. Reconnect, I can do this, I have to. Chiron tried again, his foot pushing against the ground. He focused and thought, shift. A spark flashed, then flew away. When he opened his eyes again, Chiron found himself hovering just above the ground. Thud. He landed softly, relieved. No injury this time. Lying flat on the ground, he smiled in satisfaction. I did it. How far can I go now? He kept thinking and soon drifted off to sleep. There's no time to just lie here. I need to practice the connection. I need to pray. The next morning, Mark stood high up, looking out over the courtyard. The other man called out to him, "Young master." He asked Mark, "How do you feel?" Mark turned around and confidently replied, "I feel great. Today will be a historic day because I'm moving up to level 5. He squinted. 700 meters is nothing. I'll do it easily. Inside the academy, the 7th grade classroom was still quite empty. Maria walked up to the door when someone suddenly called out, "Hey, Maria, have you given up on the exam?" Maria jumped, recognizing the voice. Mark, she thought to herself, it must be him. She asked, "Aren't you at the training grounds? Are you studying?" Mark laughed loudly. Do I really look like someone who's failed at studying? He arrogantly asked Maria, "What are you doing here?" "Is that why your grades are so bad?" Mark mocked her. "You should go learn from the training centers. The best way to study is by watching and learning from people who are better than you." Maria turned to leave, hesitating as she said, "Right, good luck. I hope you pass." Mark laughed again, replying, "Really? You hope I pass?" Maria's hand shook. Mark stepped close to Maria and said, "You're really amazing. Did you know that?" It was like he was speaking secretly to a teacher. Maria quickly asked, "How do you know that?" Her response made Mark laugh. He burst into laughter. "You're so stupid. I was just testing to see if it was really you." Maria's backpack fell to the ground. "I have plenty of ways to gather information. A shy girl like you showing up at the teacher's office is a bit strange." Mark shoved Maria against the wall. "Because we're classmates. I've been nice to you. But once I'm your senior," he threatened. "Do you think things will go differently then?" Looking at Maria trembling in fear, Mark stood up straight in disgust. She's such a coward. How could she ever think about becoming a wizard? That's why, even though she's 4 years older than me, she's still in my class. Mark left, throwing one last comment over his shoulder. Just wait and see. Behind him, Maria sat down on the floor in fear. Shaking, Maria covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Mark pushed open the door and loudly asked, "Is the plan all set?" The other 4 people from the 7th grade turned around to look. One of them replied, "We'll stick to Chiron right from the start. The other 2 will protect you. Mark, so there will be 2 chances to make him fail." Mark said, "The distance for the first round is 10 meters, so make sure to push him out at least 10 times. The guy with gray hair nodded and asked, "You're really going to do what you promised if we get this done, right?" Mark's eyes flashed for a moment. "Of course. Once I level up, I'll definitely help you find a tutoring job. You won't have to worry about finding work, even if you don't graduate." Mark reassured him. My dad is the technical advisor for the Magic Association. If you help me, I'll never forget your kindness. If there's anything I can do for you, I'll definitely help. He smirked to himself, thinking, not a single mistake can happen. A genius should be careless. Inside the mist-covered mountain forest, was this the bridge they couldn't cross? The students who hadn't registered for the 7th grade exam were gathering together. The short-haired girl who had opposed Shirome's promotion to the class asked, "This is the final round, right? I'm so tired." The pink-haired girl added, "There are more people here than I expected, especially the 5th grade students. They look so intimidating standing in front of me." Talking about the 5th graders, they were all anxiously thinking, if anyone from the lower grades gets into our class, I hope it's someone super cute. Everyone laughed and said, that would be so much fun. Students from the 4th and 6th grades also came to listen in. The judges had already arrived on time, including the principal. A signal shot up into the sky. Athela glanced at it, then turned and said, "It's time." She looked at the students standing at the starting line. The test would begin in 10 minutes. Someone shouted angrily, "Damn it, this is just a cliff. Where's the bridge?" Another voice replied, "Idea, it's that bridge." Someone else looked down and saw only 3 or 4 thin ropes stretched across. They screamed, "What? What kind of bridge is this?" On the other side, someone was using binoculars to observe the group of contestants. "Here it is. This is the best spot." Sherelle eagerly held the binoculars. "It's so clear from here." Amy crossed her arms and stood behind her. "Hey, we don't have time for this. Why are you watching those 7th graders?" Siri responded, "What are you talking about? I need to cheer for your boyfriend. Give him a little luck." Amy sighed. "Whoever makes it, makes it. Whoever fails, fails. What's the point of cheering?" She bit her finger, thinking, by the way, you teleport. A friend with dark hair walked over and called out to Mark. As he warmed up, he asked, "Did you find Shirome?" The dark-haired friend replied, "No, that guy said he's not here." Mark shot him a look. "What?" Meanwhile, Shirome was still lying on the ground, an ant crawling across his face. Suddenly, Shirome's eyes snapped open, making the ants scramble away. He sprang up like a spring and shouted, "What time is it?" Someone shouted loudly, "What? Not here?" Amy looked through the binoculars. "What did you say?" "Is Shirome absent?" Sherelle panicked. "I'm not sure. I've looked everywhere, but I can't find him." Amy hesitated. Could it be? She thought, worried. Has he failed to use magic properly? "I told you." Someone muttered, "I said learning teleportation on your own is really hard." Meanwhile, the students taking the test were standing in front of a steep cliff. One of them mumbled, "This is a cliff, not a bridge." Athela spoke up. "The rules are simple. When the instructor gives the signal, you need to move to the other side of the cliff. The one who teleports the farthest will pass the test." The 7th grade students looked at each other. "Really?" One student stepped forward and asked, "So you're telling us we have to run across? If we fail the test, we'll fall, right?" The 7th graders were skeptical. "Is there really safety equipment down there?" Thad, who was standing in front of them, spoke. "As you all know, death is a real possibility in any of the magic school's programs." Thad's face was serious. "Also, this is an early promotion exam, a selection process to choose students who are suitable for the 5th-year class. So if you believe you can protect yourselves, then go ahead and participate. But if your determination is as weak as that," he coldly warned the students, "you'd better leave now while you still can." On the outside, he appeared serious, but inside, Thad was secretly laughing. "They're hesitating, huh? A little pressure is necessary to prevent safety issues." He glanced to one side. The real danger here was, when he looked at Mark's group standing with their arms crossed, it was clear they were there for competition. Mark sneered. "Why bother taking this test if you're so mediocre? In the end, all you'll do is pave the way for me in this society." He smirked. "And that little umbrella kid. I heard he's trying to pass the exam on his own. He'll definitely fail. What a joke." Mark looked forward, thinking to himself, even I have to prepare thoroughly for this. Just then, Athela raised her hand. "Everyone line up. The exam is about to begin." But then she noticed something and fell silent. A person was running toward them from a distance, clearly exhausted. It was Shirone, and everyone stared in surprise as he arrived. Shirone bent over, gasping for breath, and said, "I'm sorry." He lifted his head and looked at Athela, asking, "I still allowed to participate in the exam?" Athela hurried over to Shirone. On this side, through her binoculars, Sherelle had already spotted him. "Amy, he's over there," Sherelle said. Amy snatched the binoculars from Sherelle's hands and scolded loudly. What the hell took him so long to get here? That idiot. As Amy continued to observe, she bit her lip. Why does that kid's face look like it's covered in wounds? Did he get hurt during practice? Meanwhile, at the judges' table, Saina turned to Althea and asked, "Principal, Ms. Athela signaled that she wanted to ask you if we should give the late student a head start." Althea nodded. Managing the situation is also a skill students need. Let the exam proceed as planned. Simon paused for a moment, then replied, "Understood. So." An orange flare shot up into the sky. Athela turned around and shouted, "Get ready, the exam will begin as scheduled." Athela spoke to Chiron, who was standing unsteadily. "Chiron, if you want to give up, just let you know." Chiron took a few slow steps forward. "Thank you for worrying about me, but I'm fine." Someone waved at Chiron. "Over here." He looked up confused and said, "Thanks." The person who spoke earlier glanced at someone standing a little to the side of Chiron and signaled. "Step 1, success. Get rid of that kid within 10 moves." Chiron lowered his head, breathing heavily, sweat pouring down. He glanced ahead, putting all his focus into what lay before him. Athela raised her hand high and said, "The early advancement test for 7th grade officially begins now. Everyone, get ready." Athela glanced at the watch on her wrist. The students had already lined up in their positions, all crouching down, preparing themselves. Mark gave a quick glance to the person next to him and signaled, "Just follow my plan." The person next to him nodded. Chiron also focused, mentally preparing. Athela fired a flare into the sky as a signal. All the students in the competition rushed forward. Chiron sprinted ahead like everyone else, with the other two following closely behind. They exchanged nods as they ran. The clock ticked away. Each second of the test passed quickly. The children had reached this point after numerous intense training sessions. However, this was the first time they had faced the cliff. What would it feel like to have the sky spread out beneath their feet? The heat creeping up through their toes. Would they feel excitement or fear? This was a world they had never known. There was only one strategy the children could think of. The students ran ahead, determined to claim the top spot. Each one thought to themselves. The chance to take first place was completely within reach. 2 seconds passed in the test, and the cliff was now just 20 meters away. Mark was pushing himself to run at full speed. He thought to himself, running faster won't get me in first place. The key is to use teleportation at the right moment. In theory and practice, the key to winning was knowing the perfect timing for the jump. Where you jump from will decide the outcome. It didn't matter whether it was earlier or later as long as you had the courage to do it. His red-haired friend accidentally kicked his foot and the cliff was still quite far off. The guy decided to risk it. The red-haired friend shouted, "Forget it," and instantly vanished in a flash of yellow light. A nearby friend was also in a hurry. I'm going too." Everyone scrambled to use their teleportation spells as the timer for the test hit 3 seconds, with only 5 meters left to the cliff. The leading group took off. Someone yelled, "Damn it, I'm definitely going to make it." With only 3 meters left, another friend rushed forward. One of Mark's teammates ran up behind him. "Sorry, Mark, I'm going ahead." Mark screamed. "What am I supposed to do if the escort group leaves first?" He gritted his teeth in frustration. Bunch of cowards. Mark kept charging ahead, his mind racing with worry. What if I fall? At 2 meters, Mark jumped. The timer hit 3.5 seconds, and Chiron was still running full speed. One of Mark's teammates who was in charge of pulling Chiron's legs was doing the same. What's this crazy guy's deal? Why is he following me so closely? Another friend hesitated. Who else is left besides us? Well, someone shouted, "I'm going ahead," and then vanished. The 2 people responsible for holding Chiron back also started using magic. Chiron kept running forward with only a meter left between him and the edge. 3.7 seconds had passed. Chiron still felt it wasn't the right time to jump, not until he was right at the cliff's edge. He made up his mind that he had to catch up with them. The students watching from Amy's side were left speechless. Even the judges on Sina's team couldn't believe it. Athela anxiously watched, and small whispers began to spread. Is he really going to jump like that? Chiron Arian passed the 2-meter mark. The exam had been going on for 4 seconds. At the Ojin family mansion, it was similar to the previous swordsmanship competition. This is the first time I've seen someone not flinch in front of my father. Aren't you scared at all? These were all words of astonishment from Ryan, who himself wouldn't dare to look his own father in the eye. A year ago, in the Ojin family mansion Ryan's room, hearing Ryan's praise for him, Chiron felt a bit embarrassed. "Oh, that? It's nothing special. I just read in a book once that fear comes from imagination." But what really surprised Chiron was Ryan's knightly oath. How can your knight's oath be this strong? Even Chiron didn't expect it. Ryan was going to make the knight's oath with him. Remembering the book, Chiron thought that only humans were afraid of swords. He calmly explained that he imagined he would die right after the jump. For example, even if we jump off a cliff, we don't actually die until we hit the ground right. So I stopped imagining the future and focused on the present. That means I need to find a solution. To avoid fear, he stopped imagining the future and focused on the present, doing his best to find the answer. This really helped him a lot. After hearing his explanation, Ryan couldn't believe it and felt incredibly foolish. Chiron, are you stupid? Like really stupid? Are you being called stupid? Shiron was taken aback, a little surprised. He watched calmly as Ryan talked about dangerous things as if they were nothing. Ryan, sweating all over, grabbed Shiron's shoulders and shouted, "If you fall off that cliff, you'll die. You'll definitely die." "What the hell are you talking about?" Seeing that Ryan misunderstood and was worried, Shiron quickly tried to explain. No, that's not what I meant. Think clearly. I wouldn't die the moment I jumped off." Back in the present, all the students watching, along with the teachers, were extremely anxious and on edge. The clock in Ms. Ethela's hand ticked second by second. At the cliff, all the students who were part of the test had already turned into streaks of light and flew off, but it was only then that Shiron started to jump. His whole body emitted a faint golden light as he began to open his spiritual realm. The wind resistance was so strong when he used the teleportation spell that it created pressure on his body. "I can't lose focus. If the connection breaks, everything will be over." The moment Shiron fell, his entire body was enveloped by a layer of light. The space around him began to change. His body shot upwards, speeding away at the speed of light, gradually catching up to the students ahead of him. Shiron passed the group of students in front of him. At that moment, one of the students noticed and screamed. Everyone around him was shocked. They couldn't believe that Shiron had caught up, even past them. What? How far behind was he that he was able to pass us like this? Seeing Shiron's speed past them, the student was in disbelief. On the other side of the mountain, the group of students cheered loudly as they saw him enter the race. Everyone was shouting encouragement for Shiron. "It's starting. Go for it." Though it was just a brief moment when seen with the naked eye. Do you see that? Yeah. The students who had just jumped down the 5th years were extremely impressed by Shiron's outstanding performance. They couldn't believe that a new student could do something like this. "Amy, this is his first time learning magic, right?" Cheryl asked, her voice trembling in surprise. Even Amy didn't know how to respond. She was so shocked that she couldn't find the words. Calming down, she understood why Shiron had started later than everyone else, so it didn't surprise her as much anymore. As expected, even though he started late, he's doing his best to make up for it. If he keeps up that pace, Shiron will always be the one in the lead. Back in the race, Mark was in the lead, but he knew it wouldn't be long before Shiron caught up. Damn it, what the hell is the operations team doing? Now the distance ahead didn't matter anymore. Mark thought to himself, glancing behind as he tried to speed up. But it was too late. Shiron passed him in the blink of an eye and took the lead. That kid was right in front of him now. Far off in the forest near the mountain range where the competition was happening, Maria was slowly making her way through the trees. Erlang Maria, it wasn't that she didn't have talent from the start. The teasing from classmates and her own insecurity and weakness had held her back. In the teacher's office, when asked about her grades, Maria was too afraid to lift her head. Her voice trembled as she answered, "Teacher, it's because they were bullying me so much." Before she could say anything else, the teacher coldly interrupted her. "It's normal for classmates to hold each other back. This is a competition. All the other students have surpassed and been promoted to the next level." At the end of the 3rd round, the students were divided into 3 groups. Leading the pack was the group with Shiron and Mark's tactical team, followed closely by the 2nd group, which stayed about 3 meters behind. The 3rd group, trailing behind, consisted of students who had used magic first out of fear. "Damn, I can't even use flight magic," one student muttered. According to the senior, even if they fell, they'd be safe, right? After flying for a while, one careless student sneezed. That single sneeze caused the student to lose balance and fall. Behind them, many other students from the 3rd group followed, all falling off the cliff, screaming in panic. "Help! Teacher, I give up!" As the students fell, others watching from the side, including the teachers, laughed, amused by the scene. As expected, the students who couldn't overcome their fear were the first to fall. The teacher calmly wrote down the names of those who had been eliminated. The students who had fallen continued to scream as they plummeted. "Where's the safety equipment? How much longer do we have to fall?" When everyone had fallen to a certain height, a large fan below the cliff suddenly started spinning. The fan created strong gusts of wind, catching the falling students and safely bringing them to the ground. Those who were still conscious lay on the ground, groaning in frustration. "This is ridiculous. You should warn us about this." After an intense race, the group of students who were eliminated all shouted out in frustration, upset that the seniors hadn't warned them about this in advance. They had no idea that this was just a small gift for the juniors, something the seniors had purposely set up. In the end, all the students in the last group were eliminated. At the 200-meter mark, the students who had made it this far were clearly exhausted, gasping for air. "I can't go any further," one of them said. Some students, too tired to keep up their teleportation spell, collapsed. "Teacher, help me." Familiar cries echoed through the air. The group in the middle had already given up quite a few. Back at the front, Mark was still trying to pick up speed. His magical abilities were average, but so far he showed no signs of fatigue. Idiots, if you don't have the ability, don't even dream of going far. The people in the middle will drop out soon enough, he muttered to himself. Hearing the cries of surrender behind him, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of superiority. Even though he was pushing himself to keep up with Chiron, the distance between them was still significant. The problem was, damn it, I don't know if it's just me, but it feels like I'm falling further behind him. Mark thought, frustrated, gritting his teeth. Mark continued to increase his speed, trying to close the gap with Chiron, but couldn't shake the irritation bubbling up inside him. He doesn't even look tired. How is that possible? He should have dropped out before the race even started. Suddenly up ahead, Chiron's body changed. A surge of energy flooded into him. Mark, watching from behind, cursed under his breath. Shit, what the hell is that? Chiron suddenly picked up speed. Miss Athela used her magical eyes to observe the test results of all the students, and even she had to admire Chiron's talent. Chiron's abilities are truly impressive. Even I have to rely on mental techniques several times, yet Chiron's pace remains constant, like a machine. The mental technique Ms. Athela uses involves objectifying herself to stabilize her mind, creating a unique sense of inertia. Not only Ms. Athela, but all the teachers grading the test nodded in agreement with her assessment. Some even commented on Mark's abilities when they saw his decent level of magic skills. On the other hand, Mark showed a clear change in his rhythm. It's decent compared to the rest of the class, but there's still a sense of impatience due to his youth. What's more, some even praise Ms. Athela's talent. As expected from her, she could detect such subtle nuances from such a distance. Her sense of empathy, truly remarkable. Thad stood silently beside, looking displeased, his face showing no signs of speaking up. The principal, watching from the sidelines, was also very pleased with the talent Chiron was showing. Cheryl, holding a pair of binoculars and watching the competition in amazement, turned to Amy beside her and asked, "Can he really use mental techniques by himself? That's impressive. Where did Chiron learn those advanced skills?" Amy, standing on the other side and still focused on watching the test, answered Cheryl's question. Though she already knew the answer, she wouldn't say it aloud. Learn them. Ordinary mages are usually taught to consciously use the unconscious world. But this kid is different. He's almost directly controlling his own subconscious, something that can't be learned. As he watched the gap between them grow, Mark realized he couldn't win by playing fair. He had to stick to the plan. Without hesitation, he shouted, "Start now." At Mark's signal, his two underlings immediately began carrying out the plan they had prepared in advance. Both were already at their limits. Damn it, he gave the signal. But why now? I guess we'll have to pour everything we got into this one last push. To complete the task at hand, one of the underlings decided to risk everything with Chiron. He drained all of his remaining mental energy to push himself to his maximum speed. Chiron sensed something was off. 2 attacks, huh? Someone changed the rhythm, he thought. In the split second of distraction, a shadow appeared right in front of Chiron, catching him by surprise. A student had jumped right in front of him, making Chiron flinch. He couldn't react in time and had to slow himself down to dodge. "What's going on?" Chiron exclaimed, still trying to figure out what was happening. Before he could make sense of it, another student charged at him. Chiron widened his eyes, staring at the student rushing toward him. The underling, though he knew his actions were wrong, couldn't go against orders. He thought to himself, "Sorry, but the game ends here. Let's fall together." The underling closed his eyes, charging full speed at Chiron with the intention of knocking him down. Chiron opened his eyes wide, staring in shock at the student who seemed ready to charge toward him. Is he really going to come at me? The student, eyes tightly shut and teeth clenched with worry, was floating in midair. In an instant, the student opened his eyes, looking around with a confused expression. As he continued to fall, he could only watch Chiron struggling in the air, and a thought crossed his mind. Did he dodge it? In the dangerous void, a few other students were also falling, their fate sealed. Chiron was desperately trying to keep his focus. His hand waved through the deep space, the vast blue sky looming ahead of him, the temperature shifting and exhaustion starting to take over. But with his final burst of determination, Chiron's emerald eyes shone brightly once more. "I can't pass out. Stay focused." A beam of light, like a ray of sunshine, shot up into the blue sky. The student falling below, witnessing this scene, couldn't help but think, he's a monster, not a human. With that thought, the student continued his fall along with several others. Below, a group of 5th grade students were still chattering away. Didn't he move kind of weird just now? Maybe he took a wrong turn? One student immediately said they probably want to crash right into the kid in front. That's more likely their real goal. The other 2 students turned to look at him in complete surprise. "How do you know that? Who would intentionally cause an accident?" When Aruki's name was mentioned, he simply sat cross-legged, arms folded in front of him, as he calmly addressed the other students. Aruki then demonstrated with his hands, one hand in a fist and the other flat, upright. He brought them closer together and explained, "One person blocks the race path ahead. while the other attacks from the side. With an indifferent expression, Aruki continued, "It's a brilliant strategy to stop both of them. The advantage of teleportation and spatial jumping. If the new student doesn't steer off the path, something terrible is definitely going to happen." After finishing his analysis, Aruki casually waved his hand and smirked. "Well, if it were me, I would have just escaped easily using the motion equation." Hearing that, the two students frowned, their faces twisted in disgust as they looked away. That pretending to be innocent act is just disgusting. Their eyes met for a moment, but according to Aruki, there was no way the teachers wouldn't notice. I don't know what they're planning. Meanwhile, the principal and Miss Scene are still watching the exam while Mark, with his abilities, is charging ahead with a confident smile and a loud, triumphant laugh. Mark grinned victoriously and said, "Everyone's definitely going to be jealous. All my dumb classmates and even the 6th graders will be my juniors. Just watch." His bright, confident blue eyes sparkled even more as he added, "This is my talent." At that moment, Chiron was still doing her best to chase after the glowing magical trail Mark had left behind. Chiron thought to herself, "Mark's in great shape. They'll definitely finish the exam. If I want to win, I have to go faster. If I rush to close the gap with my teleportation, the temperature might get destroyed." Chiron's eyes filled with determination. "I'll change my pace." Then her magical light picked up speed. Chiron surged forward, moving faster than Mark by half a step. The crowd cheered loudly and excitedly. Chiron's catching up. It's just the two of them now. "Mark, go faster." Amy, holding binoculars, looked on in amazement. How can he still use magic so powerfully when his body's in such bad shape? Meanwhile, Shorel, holding on to Amy's arm with a curious, pouty expression, asked, "Let me see more." Suddenly, Amy, her eyes wide with surprise, pulled away from the binoculars. "That's it," she said. Mark was still rushing forward, stammering, what is that?" A wave of magic, like a coil of string, sped toward Mark. He panicked and quickly jumped aside to avoid the magic as it zipped past him. "What the hell is that?" Mark muttered, still in shock, when Chiron appeared right behind him. A warning immediately popped up. Bridge difficulty level cannot be surpassed. Everyone was taken aback, stunned by the sudden message. "Level 10, Chiron said, frozen in disbelief. Both Mark and Chiron stood there, staring at the dangerous white maze in front of them as long strands of magic kept flying out. What the hell does that even mean? Level 10? What does that even mean? In front of them, Miss Sana barely had time to shout, "Professor Thad, I'm going to the equipment room to check." Professor Thad immediately shouted back as he began running off. Without missing a beat, he used magic to fly up into the air, a bright burst of magic lifting him toward the sky. Miss Sana quickly turned to the principal. "Principal, we should stop the test." Another teacher spoke up, "But this is an advanced level test, one that raises students by 2 grade levels. If we cancel it, the families will be furious. What do we do then?" Meanwhile, Principal Alpheus kept his gaze fixed on the ongoing test. When he heard another teacher speak, Principal Alpheus immediately got angry and shouted, "Is this really the time to worry about that?" Quickly signaled to stop the exam. A beam of magic shot up into the sky, appearing in front of Chiron and Mark, catching both of them by surprise. Chiron hovered in the air, staring at the signal in front of him. The exam had been called off. Meanwhile, Professor Thad's magical energy had already arrived. Stepping out of the magical field, Professor Thad rushed over and said, "I just saw the yellow signal. Does that mean the exam has been canceled?" "Ha! Here comes another pile of complaints on my desk." Professor Thad hurried to the equipment room and shouted, "Brad, did you drink again yesterday? You know how important today's test is, and now this." "I swear, this time." Professor Thad grabbed the doorknob and tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. He stopped for a moment. "Locked? Seems like this isn't just a mistake," he thought, gathering magic. A bright burst of magic flared up for an instant, but then Professor Thad hesitated. "Huh? Is someone behind that door?" He realized as a blue light appeared, revealing what was inside. Behind the door, there were 2 figures. One was slumped over the desk, and the other was sitting on the ground in front of the control panel. Thad immediately raised his hand and aimed his magic at the door. "Who's there? Open the door now, or I'll blow it up." A voice quickly responded. "Go ahead, do it. Please, teacher. Anyway, no one will know if I disappear." Thad froze. The voice triggered a small memory in his mind. He remembered holding his briefcase with a young student standing behind him. "Who are you?" Thad was startled and realized Maria. "Is that you?" Maria was sitting by the door, hugging her knees, trembling in fear. When Thad recognized her, he immediately rushed to knock on the door. "Do you know what you're doing? Open the door now and I'll treat this as an accident and give you just a light punishment." Maria screamed. "No, it's over anyway. If Mark gets promoted, I'll have to live a life like hell. What's the difference if I die here?" "What?" Thad stood in shock when he heard Maria. "I'd rather that than this." Maria screamed again, trembling in fear, holding her knees tightly. Thad stood frozen, then sighed and closed his eyes. I understand. Do whatever you want. Maria, with tears streaming down her face, suddenly looked up. If you don't want to open it, then don't. It's not really an emergency anyway. Just as I wanted, the exam has been canceled. A bright yellow signal beam shone intensely in front of Sharon and Mark. Mark clenched his teeth in frustration and thought, canceled the exam? Don't joke, the chance to level up is right in front of me. He quickly glanced at Sharon behind him. You need to reconsider, he said. No matter how much he said, there was no way out now. The opportunity to defeat that person might never come again. Sharon was breathing heavily from exhaustion, her sharp gaze still unwavering. Mark continued to glare at her in annoyance. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed and 2 beams of light shot toward them. The maze then erupted, firing dangerous magical beams. Principal Sharon and Mark have entered the maze, a voice reported. Sina gasped, covering her mouth in shock. No! The principal clenched his fists in anger, his face turning from calm to furious. What are these idiots thinking? Sina, frantic, watched the 2 of them charge into danger like moths to a flame. Her heart was burning with worry, and she shouted, Principal, we need to stop this now. It's too dangerous. What on earth is Professor Thad doing? What is going on, Principal? With that, all the teachers rushed over to the principal, seeking his decision. The principal was now visibly enraged. His fists were clenched tightly, his face no longer holding the gentle expression from before. His eyes, glowing with a golden hue, followed the 2 as they entered the maze. Inside, he felt a deep sense of disappointment. I thought if it were you, things would be different. But if you let greed cloud your judgment and act impulsively, you'll never find your way out of this maze. In the maze, Sharon kept up his speed, skillfully maneuvering to find the way out. The students watching were in a panic, unable to sit still, full of worry and anxiety. Oh my gosh, what did we do? What should we do now? Amy, Sherelle said, covering her mouth with both hands, unsure of what to say. She called out to her best friend standing beside her. Amy, I'm so frustrated and helpless, watching the competition continue while we can't do anything. Those idiots, level 10 is for professionals. Amy replied, clearly upset. From the cliffside, thick black ropes shot out, forming various shapes as they violently sped toward Sharon, who struggled to dodge them. The speed of the traps was overwhelming. One would barely be avoided before another appeared. There was no time to think. If this kept up, his mental energy would be drained completely. Meanwhile, Mark confidently charged into the maze. Either way, both of them are going to be eliminated. The one who goes the furthest wins. If I perform well here, maybe I'll get recognized, Mark thought to himself, pushing forward without hesitation. He swiftly navigated through the maze's narrow gaps, feeling pleased as he watched Sharon continue to struggle. So, what do you think? Seeing my skills yet? You're going to be stuck there forever, Mark smirked as the thick, pitch-black walls of the maze continued to close in around Sharon. He tried to avoid the maze-like obstacles rushing toward him while desperately looking for a way out. But when he saw Mark charging ahead, he wanted to shout a warning about the danger, but it was too late. No. At that very moment in the control room, the screen of the machine lit up with a red glow. An alarm blared, followed by Maria's voice. Teacher, what is competition really? Maria asked, sitting against the door with her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Her voice cracked with emotion as she spoke. Is it about encouraging lives to push others into the abyss? Is this really the kind of competition the Academy wants? Thad, sitting against the back of the door, tried to comfort her. You misunderstood, Maria. Before he could finish, Maria interrupted loudly. Don't compare me to you. What would someone like him, a teacher always seen as a genius, understand? Her voice trembled as tears streamed down her face in anguish. I followed your advice, I endured, I persisted. But here, if a student doesn't have talent, who even remembers them? Someone as ordinary as me. Seeing Maria so upset, Thad continued to speak gently to her. I'm not sure if you know this, but I also graduated from this school. When I was in the graduating class, you were just a new student. Maria stopped crying when she heard Thad's words. She hadn't expected him to remember something from so many years ago. You still remember that? Thad, with a hint of nostalgia in his voice, continued. Well, have you ever heard the rumors about a genius named Save who studied here? Her voice still shaky from crying, Maria answered, No, I've never heard of that. I've always been at the bottom. I repeated 5th year for 5 years, and all that happened was I became more and more frustrated as my classmates moved ahead easily. Thad went on to share stories from his time at the academy. His words carried a sense of nostalgia and loss as he recalled his own experiences. There's no way you're teacher now, Maria said, a bit in disbelief. Thad laughed loudly, cutting off Maria's words, then continued his story. One day, the principal caught me and scolded me. Hey, what's going on? That kid hit you first. One evening, in a quiet corner of the academy, Thad's voice echoed. It was just a small thing. Why did the teacher have to step in? Thad, his face marked with bruises like he'd just been in a fight, said defiantly, I usually don't care about stuff like this, but do you know the one thing that a mage must never do? The principal interrupted him. It's comparing yourself to others. Hit straight to the heart, Thad avoided looking the principal in the eye, but still argued back. What are you talking about? Are you giving me a lecture now? Not bothered by Thad's attitude, the principal continued calmly. Mages call it the existence that erases the ego. You only need to look at yourself. If you can do that, then you truly have erased your ego. If you keep looking at others on your journey, one day it'll end up lost. In the maze, Mark was still confidently charging forward until he realized something was wrong. Looking at the grid in front and behind him, Mark noticed it was locked. He was cornered with no way out. Panic set in, and the fear that rose within him made it hard for him to think. All he could feel now was regret. I shouldn't have taken this path. Trapped and unable to escape, with the maze walls closing in to attack, Mark could only think of one thing. Is this how I'm going to die? He felt an overwhelming sense of regret and, terrified, screamed for help. Help me. Outside, seeing Mark in danger, everyone was filled with worry and fear, shouting, Mark, no. Just as it seemed Mark would die, a hand reached out. The hand grabbed the collar of Mark's shirt, pulling him away and saving him at the last second. Grabbing Mark by the collar, Chiron gritted his teeth and pushed himself to the limit, trying to escape the maze's attacks. When everyone in Class 7 saw Chiron save Mark, they cheered in relief. Mark saved. Chiron saved him. Then one student realized they were still in the middle of the competition and asked, but this is a test. Why would he save his competitor? Hearing this question, another student yelled at the first one, You idiot. Does winning even matter if someone's about to die right in front of you? It doesn't matter anymore. Another student noticed how Chiron had saved Mark in a unique way and asked, how could he teleport like that? In midair, Mark continued to struggle, shouting for help. Help me, please, help me. Finding Mark's cries annoying, Chiron snapped, Quiet. I'm thinking. These traps are illusions. We have to see through them to find a way out. Let's move forward for now. As Chiron tried to figure out how to escape the maze while also carrying the burden of Mark, he felt a bit exhausted. Using light speed, he soared upwards, carrying Mark with him. The traps were chasing after them. As Chiron moved, the traps in the maze seemed to come to life and followed him closely. Running upward was useless. He had to avoid them. The students below saw that flying up wouldn't help and shouted loudly to warn him. That's dangerous. Get out of the way. With the maze closing in fast, Chiron realized that pulling back was pointless. But right now, he couldn't think of any better option. Increasing the distance didn't matter. What should he do? A sudden idea sparked in his mind. He knew exactly what he had to do now. That's it. There was a way. He needed to turn back. Without thinking too much, Chiron sped up and pulled Mark along as he headed back. Seeing the protagonist turn around, Aruki excitedly clenched his fists and shouted, That's right. Going forward isn't always the right choice. Sometimes turning back is the right answer. On the other side, when the students saw how excellently Chiron was handling the situation, they began to feel confused. It had only been a month. Could he really have trained all by himself? I thought he only got in here because of connections. I didn't even think he knew how to use magic. Yeah, maybe we misunderstood him. You can do it. Ignoring their confusion, all the students began shouting out to encourage Chiron. It's dangerous. Keep going. Shirel was amazed, realizing that Chiron's efforts weren't just for the exam. They were for something more. Amy confidently stated from one side, yes, he practices so hard not just to do well in this exam. After all, the promotion exam is just a small part of the journey to becoming a mage. He simply wants to become a skilled mage. Shirel spoke up. In the control room, Thad continued to comfort Maria. Competition is just a tool to help us reach the finish line faster. It's okay to go slowly. When we cross the finish line, we'll all be mages. Thad's words echoed. At that moment, all the teachers and students, including the principal, were left speechless, stunned as they watched Chiron skillfully navigate through the maze. Behind the door, Maria softly muttered in regret, Is it too late now? Knowing he had successfully reassured Maria, Thad smiled gently and said, I'll help you, so why not be a little braver? Each word Thad spoke gave her more courage. Maria broke down in tears, filled with regret, but also perhaps crying because she felt the sense of relief. Back at the exam, unexpectedly, the principal spoke up, Continue with the exam. Sina and the other teachers turned to look at him in shock. The principal, however, remained unfazed and spoke firmly, I will take full responsibility for everything. The landscape ahead looked full of danger, but the sound of the crowd cheering still echoed. Hang in there, it's dangerous, stay away. Chiron, with a determined look in his eyes, continued moving forward. With one hand, he pulled Mark along as they advanced into the maze of danger. This trap seemed almost alive, shifting and unpredictable, with no pattern. He wanted to save Mark, but couldn't even pinpoint their location. Mark screamed in fear, "I don't want to die." Chiron, on the other hand, stayed calm, thinking clearly. "First, I need to sense the entire structure and focus on one point." Chiron used his eyes to search for a safe way out, and soon noticed that the whole maze was glowing. He had been through something like this before. It felt like running for his life. At that moment, Chiron saw the path to take. With all his strength, Chiron sped up to his limit, charging toward the maze along the path he had already mapped out in his mind. His speed was so fast that only a yellow blur could be seen. Chiron darted through the gaps in the maze at lightning speed before they disappeared. Inside the maze, he moved like a fish in water, navigating effortlessly. The students watching were left in stunned silence, their mouths hanging open in awe at Chiron's power. Mark, still being dragged along, had passed out and was foaming at the mouth without anyone noticing. Amy and Sherelle were both equally shocked by his actions. All the teachers were deeply impressed by Chiron's display. How did he do it? The danger had unlocked his hidden strength. A limit had been reached, and it was enough to push him forward. Alpheus seemed to realize the source of Chiron's hidden power. But what he didn't expect was that even he couldn't know the limits of this child. Yet I couldn't sense any satisfaction or desire from that kid. Could it be because this child has no limits? The maze kept shifting and changing, constantly heading towards Chiron. No matter how it transformed, Chiron was able to dodge everything. Alpheus, who had been watching everything unfold, was in complete shock. He could now sense that there wasn't a single distracting thought in Chiron's mind. It was truly amazing. No attachments, no distractions. Athela continued to watch closely every second, every minute. Although her expression remained calm inside, her mind wasn't as composed as it appeared. The density of the spiritual field was nearly 99.9% in a state of chaos. Yet everything was calculated perfectly. The talent was extraordinary, but this challenge was incredibly dangerous. Chiron passed through maze after maze, and each time the challenge grew harder. When he overcame one trial in the maze, he realized that the gaps between obstacles had narrowed by about a meter. He kept thinking of a solution. Moving instantly 10 meters was impossible to get past. Then split the instant movement into a tenth, following the order right, left, right, left, right, left, left, right, left. While thinking, his body followed the plan and slipped through the gaps, less than a meter wide, at the speed of light. Chiron moved on to the next level. Now the traps awaited. At this level, the maze forms a series of tightly packed hexagons resembling a beehive, which causes Chiron a bit of trouble. Chiron quickly realizes the issue. "So I can't go straight through. The gaps are incredibly narrow." Without hesitation, Chiron comes up with an immediate solution. "In that case, I'll break it down into smaller steps." Rainbow Drop, has she finally made it this far? Aruki excitedly clenches his fists, shouting so loudly that everyone around him jumps in surprise. What is that? Is she bending light? Someone can't help but ask, seeing Chiron navigate the maze. "Aruki, why is the light bending?" "Doesn't light only travel in a straight line?" Aruki, hearing his classmates' questions, kindly explains. "That's a simple principle. How could you not know? If you differentiate a circle, you get an infinite straight line, and the movement distance is divided by 1,000th. 1,000th? No way!" Everyone shouts in astonishment. "How did you figure that out?" Everyone is curious about the calculations. "It's a feeling. It's intelligence. Isn't he supposed to be really smart?" Aruki responds helplessly. "In short, he's a genius, completely the opposite of." Aruki continues to brag, but no one's paying attention to him. They're all too busy admiring Chiron's talent. A genius? That's terrifying. At this point, the maze begins to shift again. The dark strands, almost alive, start to come together, forming a unified whole. The threads were becoming thicker and thicker, forming an enormous shape. This also made things harder for Chiron. "Too big," she murmured. Chiron stared in shock at what the maze had created. As she realized what it was, all the teachers jumped up in panic and shouted loudly. "No, that's the dragon's maze." A huge, terrifying black dragon's head formed from the maze, appearing right in front of Chiron. The maze continued to move, and even though Teacher Thad had been gone for a while, he still hadn't been able to stop it, which made Sina extremely anxious. "What is he doing?" she wondered out loud. Unable to wait any longer, Sina used teleportation and shot off like a streak of light. Mark, now regaining his senses, looked around and asked, "Where am I?" As soon as Mark snapped back to reality, he looked up, only to be met with the sight of the dragon's mouth wide open, coming straight toward him. He screamed in terror. A monster! Mark thrashed around in panic, but Chiron remained calm, trying to figure out how to break free. "I need to remember the sequence I saw. First, the circle goes to the left. While Sharon was focused on finding a way out, Mark was completely losing it. He frantically begged, "Please save me. I'll be good. I swear, just save me." Meanwhile, Saina had teleported directly to where Teacher Thad was. As soon as her feet hit the ground, she rushed toward the control room shouting, "Teacher Thad, what's going on?" Seeing Saina rush over so quickly, Thad immediately spoke up, "Miss Saina, what's going on here?" Saina, in a hurry and without patience, shouted loudly, "I don't have time for this. Turn off the equipment right now." Has the exam been canceled? Thad still didn't understand what was happening. He thought the exam had been called off long ago. No, it hasn't been canceled. Iris, Sharon, and Mark are still at the exam site. Saina shouted again, surprising Thad. "What?" Damn, without thinking, Thad quickly turned around and ran toward the control panel. "Miss Saina, Mr. Thad." Suddenly, a voice called their names in a panic. Athela rushed over to them, her voice frantic as she shouted, "Sharon!" At that very moment, the dragon lunged forward, swallowing both of them in one swift motion. All the students who witnessed it screamed in fear, unable to look at what was happening. The teachers and students stared frozen as everything unfolded in the blink of an eye. Time seemed to stand still as the second hand of the clock ticked forward. The clock kept moving, but then it stopped right at 12 o'clock. The hands of the clock reversed about a minute before Athela arrived, standing in front of the dragon's giant jaws about to snap at Sharon, who was holding Mark's shirt. Mark looked terrified. Everyone around them was in complete shock. Amy and Sherelle clung to each other, screaming, unable to look at what was about to happen next. Sharon stood in front of the monster, using all his strength. His eyes were glowing a bright blue and sweat dripped down his face as everything around him seemed to freeze. Just a minute before the clash, he was calm, almost as if he had stepped into another perspective, alive, still breathing. Think, he told himself as the neurons in his body fired at full capacity. 1/10 of a second, a burst of light shatters the barriers, 1% of a second. The light was weaving through the square blocks, 6 intersections in total, with 9 shifts, including an escape route. 1,000th of a second passed, and he worried he had made a mistake. The light was blocked by a red wall. Sharon thought, "Mark and I can't escape this path. I need to find another way." Back in the present moment, the clock struck 12, and the monster charged forward aggressively. The people around him were in a panic. Amy screamed, "Sharon!" Alpheus was about to use his power to save them, but then something clicked in his mind, and he stopped. A burst of light flickered out from the darkness as if trying to escape the abyss of the universe. The loud explosions of light crackled in the blue sky. Everyone below rushed toward the light. In unison, they shouted, "No, it can't be." For that light, Sharon shot straight down to the ground, pulling Mark with him. To the shock of everyone, below, voices murmured, "He really made it out. They're not ghosts, are they?" Athela stood frozen, stunned by what was happening before her, then quickly ran off to somewhere else. Sharon panted, still in disbelief that he had escaped death by such a narrow margin. What just happened? Did I really make it out? I can't remember anything. The engine system of the invincible bridge had been disabled, and the level was 0. With everything he had just witnessed, the boy with the spiky hair exclaimed in surprise that was level 10 difficulty. He's already surpassed the expert level of the advanced class. Sharon, exhausted and panting after the challenge, shouted, "I seriously thought I was done for." Everyone was taken aback by his words. Sherelle, overcome with emotion, started crying out of joy. He did it. He really did it. Amy smiled softly, thinking to herself, "He's so cool. People who succeed through sheer effort never boast or act arrogant." Everyone gathered around Sharon, excited to congratulate him for overcoming the tough challenge. "Congrats, you're amazing. You can directly accept it into level 5. The level 6 students are going to be so jealous." The professor suddenly appeared and asked, "Did Sharon really make it through?" Saina sighed, her voice full of regret. "I missed this important moment because of Professor Thad." Thad, feeling wrong, said, "I'll explain later, but I try my best." Saina scolded him, saying he hadn't helped at all. Thad was deeply hurt by her words. Saina then spoke up, "Since both of you finished at the same time, we need to confirm things. Principal, could you please announce the details?" She hesitated. Alfie, as the blank expression, continued to call out, "Principal." He paused, deep in thought, wondering if I'd been worrying too much. He glanced at Sharon and thought, "I'm so glad you've shown everyone the light of the Milch family." Thad looked at Alfie as thinking about the title given to the one who laid the foundation for the definition of photons, the one who had received the King's Award, the Golden Circle. Saina, looking worried, asked, "What's wrong with him?" A sudden surge of grief rose in her heart because of Sharon's exceptional talent. Thad stepped forward, placing his right hand over his chest, bowing his head in respect. "Principal, please share your decision. I believe the one who will shape the future of this academy has already appeared." Alpheus laughed softly. "Ha ha! Yes, I've been a bit absent-minded. He was reflecting on the past after witnessing his talented student. He realized that he felt a bit envious of Chiron's innocent love for magic. Thinking back to that moment, he couldn't believe in fate. Alpheus held up a pendant in one hand, continuing to ponder. It's been so long since my heart has raced like this. Standing in front of all the students and professors of the academy, Alpheus spoke up, even though only one person is being accepted. I want to commend all of the students who participated. The courage you showed today will inspire the world to move closer to a brighter future. The person who passed today's test is Arian Chiron. The crowd cheered, but when they looked back at him, they saw a tired, stunned expression on his face, his eyes blank. From the group, a figure slowly stepped forward. It was Mark, moving painfully with the injuries from the recent challenge. The people around him whispered, "Slider Mark, don't tell me he's going to protest just because he was with Chiron." But this new student was the one who saved him, and the whole conflict seemed pretty suspicious. Mark grew increasingly uneasy. How could this be? I saw with my own eyes that he's truly a genius. Chiron turned to Mark with a frightening look. Mark lowered his head, admitting, "I've been wrong all this time." With sincerity, Mark continued, "No, I'm sorry, senior. As a mage, I accept full responsibility." All the 7th year students, frightened, lowered their heads in unison. Together, it shouted, "We were wrong, senior. We accept the punishment." Chiron, still tired, smiled and said, "All right, I hope you all mean it." They shouted, "Yes, yes, senior." Everyone thought to themselves, "We're lucky we apologized first." Meanwhile, Chiron thought, "I just want to sleep. I'm so tired I can't think straight." This is ridiculous. Amy urged, "Let's go, Sharel." Sharel questioned, "Don't you think we should stay with Chiron for a moment like this?" Amy responded, "I don't have time." Inside, she thought to herself, "He's proven himself. Now it's my turn." Suddenly, Chiron looked at Amy and shouted, "Amy." Amy felt a wave of unease. The two of them stopped, and he raised his hand, pointing at her. Chiron said, "I kept my promise, right? Right now, I'm not fully alert, but I'll catch up to you soon enough." Amy froze, and the people around them gasped. Calling out the girl's name like that, could it be that he was jealous of his girlfriend? He was so cool. Chiron. Amy couldn't hold back her tears after hearing what he said. Chiron wouldn't remember this when he woke up. He had been promoted to grade 5. Meanwhile, somewhere, Othello was searching for something, her mind filled with questions. This is strange. I'm sure Synesthesia was following Chiron. She was worried. Did I lose him in the Dragon Maze? In a lavish mansion in a room called the Disciplinary Committee, a meeting was taking place. Thad was holding a report about a violation, while Maria stood behind him, her head bowed, confessing her wrongdoings. Maria had honestly admitted her mistakes and was now hoping to face the consequences. However, Chiron, Mark, and even the gatekeeper, Brad, who had all been affected by the sleep induction spell, spoke up, saying they didn't want Maria to be punished. The other students, moved by their words, also began to acknowledge their own mistakes. Some even brought up issues related to Chiron's test. From behind Mark, more students stepped forward to admit their faults, and the atmosphere grew increasingly heated. Chiron looked at Mark and thought, is he trying to keep his promise to take responsibility? Alpheus spoke up, "I believe Maria's situation is unfortunate. She didn't use that machine to harm anyone." With a dignified expression, he continued, "But according to the rules, disciplinary action must be carried out." Chiron placed a hand on his chest and said, "Then I accept punishment as well. I ignored the signal to postpone the test and entered the labyrinth. On top of that, I dragged Mark into such a dangerous place." Alpheus rubbed his eyes and sighed. Who would have thought we witnessed something like this in our school? Meanwhile, Thad thought to himself, this has gone far beyond what the headmaster intended. The students all bowed their heads as they accepted their punishment. They had been blinded by competition, pride, and jealousy, unable to see the truth. Now, in order to become respected mages, they were also acknowledging their mistakes. Thad sighed, recalling the first time he met the headmaster. He thought to himself, who would have thought teaching could be done this way? You've taught me so much too, Professor. Alpheus struck the gavel, delivering the verdict. A sharp crack echoed through the room. The students burst into tears. Mark walked up to Maria, lowered his head, and apologized. Meanwhile, Santa was writing up violation reports for each student. This was an unprecedented event since the school's founding. Every single person here was being punished. The violation records read, Merlangoria, 19 years old, class 7, homeroom professor, disciplinary action, suspension for 2 months. Slider Mark, 15 years old, class 7, homeroom professor, suspension for 2 months. Mark and Maria received a 2-month suspension, while the other students were suspended for 1 month. As for Chiron's report, he was only required to submit a written reflection. Recalling the moment Chiron admitted his mistake, Stana asked, Chiron, why did you enter the labyrinth even after seeing the signal? Chiron replied, at that moment, I didn't want to lose. The only thing on my mind was solving the labyrinth. I don't even remember much else. Sangha smiled and said, you have a positive side to you that I didn't think you had, even though you seem so well behaved. On Chiron's representative paper, it was noted that he had advanced to the 5th grade. Was it because he's a boy? Back at Chiron's spot, he was fast asleep from exhaustion. In his dream, it seemed like someone was calling his name. Chiron. Chiron. Suddenly, a loud voice shouted, the dragon's labyrinth. A flash of light streaked by. It was him, flying like a beam of light. He focused even harder. His eyes opened wide as he remembered the stares that had been on him. I will erase myself, erase myself. He recalled what had happened, feeling as if his soul was breaking apart into tiny pieces, spreading across the world as if it had always been part of this world. Chiron kept charging forward, and the space around him started to crack. He continued to race ahead, and the space around him shattered faster, infinitely. Suddenly, he fell into the broken space, speeding uncontrollably. Chiron was terrified. Beyond the crack, there was just an empty void of darkness. Then the sound of a piano echoed, pulling Chiron out of the terrifying dream. He wondered, a piano? Is it morning already? He put on his uniform and adjusted his tie. He thought he couldn't remember anything, but why did it feel so difficult? He picked up a book. Right, the notebook Amy lent me helped me remember the rules of magic. He flipped through the pages. He had to return it in the combined class today. He wanted to repay her for helping him all the way through. It was like he saw something, a question mark appearing all over his face. In the practice hall number 2, Chiron called out, Amy. Amy turned around, her face full of worry, while Chiron greeted Chiron. Chiron, how's everything? Are you okay? Chiron held a basket full of apples and handed it to them. Thanks to you guys, I wanted to say thank you. Amy asked, confused, what's this? Apples. Chiron handed Amy the notebook and said, I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but it looks like you like apples. She thought to herself, but I like cherries. Since when do I like apples? She quickly flipped through the pages of the notebook. Written on it was, what do I think? The issue was time. An apology should be enough, right? Sorry. Apples, apples. In Korean, apple and sorry sound the same. Embarrassed, she immediately ran off shouting, whatever. Cheryl called out to Amy, where are you going? The class is about to start, leaving the two of them confused about what had just happened. What's up with her? Cheryl chased after Amy, who easily passed the advanced test and moved up to the graduation class. But it seemed there were still problems that even her genius brain couldn't solve. A month later, the 7th grade students returned after a month-long suspension. In unison, they shouted, Senior, we saved your seat. Chiron was surprised by this. He nervously said, you guys don't have to do that. Strangely, every time they had mixed grade classes, the 7th graders would save him a seat. Everyone remembered the time he had made a scary face, and they quickly returned to their seats, feeling like they had become a feared senior. Suddenly, a voice asked him, is there a seat for me? Juniors. Recognizing the voice, he turned around. Of course, Senior Sherelle, please have a seat, he said. Sherelle continued, you don't seem as lively without your cute girlfriend around. He laughed nervously. You're the one who seems lonely, actually. You two are always together. Sherelle replied, that's right. That's why I'm about to graduate. Chiron looked shocked. Really? Sherelle nodded. I was planning to graduate and live a normal life, but after seeing you and Amy, I felt excited again. I realized I've wasted a bit of my youth. Plus, it seems like Amy wants to become a soldier. Chiron was surprised. Soldier? You're saying she plans to join the war? She said this in frustration. Are you two even really dating? Chiron was worried. Isn't that dangerous? Even though Thormia was peaceful for now, if war broke out, Sherelle added, if a war does start, all mages are required to join. That's why we get so many benefits and support. Plus, Amy specializes in sniper magic, so she'll only be involved behind the scenes. Doesn't that sound cool? Agent Amy was stunning and charismatic. Thinking about that, Chiron replied, right, why should I worry about someone who's top tier? Specialization, huh? He waved goodbye to Sherelle. Starting in 5th grade, students began thinking about their future careers as mages. If you're good at something, it's a huge advantage, but that's not always easy to talk about with students who aren't doing so well. Suddenly, a voice called out to Chiron. Hey Chiron, you still planning to practice on your own? If you need any help, just ask me. It was Need, an incredibly friendly guy. He was a friend I truly appreciated for always talking to me, even though I wasn't the best at socializing. Even though his grades were average, he was so skilled that he could control lightning, and his versatility wasn't exactly something you'd call friendly. Seeing Chiron's sigh, Need said, you're doing that again. Chiron thought everyone has their own way of doing things. 5th year students are completely different from 7th years. Even though we're the same age, they're so much more mature than me. Suddenly, 2 voices called out from behind, hey, Chiron, listen to us. What do you two think? Shiron was surprised to hear his name paired with Need's. Need responded, "What?" A boy with neatly trimmed hair spoke up, "I told you. I just can't agree with that." Shiron thought, are they arguing about something? This is bad. What if they start avoiding me again because I don't understand what they're talking about? What is this about? Chemistry? Biology? Literature? Professor Athela or Sina? Who do you like more? Shiron's eyes widened, his mouth dropping open in shock. Completely caught off guard, he thought, "What?" Need let out a sigh before speaking in a low voice. "What kind of question is that?" Shiron quickly shifted his gaze to him, silently agreeing exactly Need. Then, with a frown of discontent, Need raised his voice. "I'm on Professor Sina's side, obviously." Hearing that, Shiron let out a silent scream in his mind, grabbing his head with both hands as if he'd just been struck by lightning. After saying that, Need crossed his arms and loudly challenged the other two. "Don't you guys know that Professor Sina is the type who is both charming and wise?" Hearing himself being called out, the person standing across from Need raised his voice in disagreement. "No, it's Professor Athela who makes us feel like we want to be protected." Shiron, standing nearby, felt extremely uncomfortable watching the three of them argue. He thought to himself, teenage boys. Suddenly, a voice called out to him. "Shiron, what do you think?" He jumped in surprise, standing there with his mouth open, thinking, "What do I think?" Caught off guard by the question, Shiron hesitated, deep in thought. Right. To have a happy school life, I need to learn how to fit in with everyone. Standing before three pairs of sharp, almost menacing eyes staring at him, Shiron felt the pressure of having to choose between the two professors. He was uncomfortable, silently thinking, but both of them are professors I respect. Choosing one feels a bit... After thinking for a moment, he clenched his fist and, with determination, said, "For me, I." Before he could finish his sentence, he suddenly froze, confused. The two people who had been glaring at him with cold eyes were now quietly backing away, acting shy. They waved at him and said, "Ah, sorry, we'll come back later." He stood frozen like a statue, quietly crying inside, wondering to himself, is it because I couldn't answer? Need, standing behind Shiron, saw someone, but quickly turned away, raised his hand, and replied loudly, "No, it's because of him." Then he called out in a loud voice, "Hey, Aruki." Aruki's cold gaze landed on them. He walked over, one hand on his chin and the other in his pocket, taking his time as if he had no clue what was going on. He asked, "What are you guys so excited about?" Need let out a soft sigh and gave a wry smile, answering him same old, just asking which professor is the best for something like that. They weren't kids anymore, Need thought, deciding not to say too much. He raised his hand, introduced, "Shiron, this is Aruki." When his name was mentioned, Shiron, who was standing behind Need, thought to himself, he changes his attitude so quickly. He awkwardly spoke up, "Hello." Need continued, "This is the first time you two are meeting, right? Aruki is the oddball in the 5th year." After the introduction, Aruki reached out his hand, looking at Shiron with sharp, cold eyes, and said, "Nice to meet you. Arian Shiron, I've heard a lot about you. Honestly, who in this school doesn't know you?" Shiron was caught off guard. As he reached out to shake Aruki's hand, he couldn't help but noticed Aruki's hand and wondered to himself, that voice. Suddenly, he remembered a voice in a vague face of someone he couldn't quite see, saying to him, "Don't hesitate. If you want to do something, just do it." The voice continued echoing in his ears, "You came here to become a wizard, didn't you?" At that moment, he stood frozen silently, thinking who? Then, with a bright smile, he grabbed Aruki's hand with both of his and said loudly, "It's you. Thank you. Thanks to you, I was able to successfully use the redirecting form." Aruki looked down at his hand, which was being held tightly, a bit surprised, but didn't respond. Shiron continued, "Thanks a lot for what happened last time." After a brief silence, Aruki lifted his gaze to meet Shiron's, smirking as he said, "You're the boring type, aren't you?" Shiron paused, caught off guard by Aruki's words, and muttered, "Ha." Need saw this and quickly stepped in, pulling the two apart. He smiled at Shiron and explained, "Don't mind him, he always talks like that." Then he turned to Aruki, holding his hands up in front of his chest, saying, "Hey, what kind of talk is that?" Aruki scratched his head, acting clueless, and calmly replied, "Ha, that was a compliment." With that, Aruki walked ahead, glanced back at the two of them, his eyes narrowing as he smirked and said, "Anyway, good luck. The 5th class is full of weirdos, so watch out." Need heard that and asked, "Aruki, where are you going?" "What about class?" Aruki turned around and walked off without saying a word, leaving behind just 3 words, "I don't care." Shiron was shocked by this response. He silently wondered, doesn't he care about joining the magic class? After Aruki left, Need scratched his head, sighed with a bored look, and explained, "Sorry about that. He's always like this, but once you get used to it, you'll see he's actually a good guy." Shiron responded with a confused tone, "He's a bit strange, isn't he?" Need continued, yeah, if you want to understand him better, it's going to be tough. But honestly, he's a genius. He paused for a moment before adding, the problem is he's a genius in a really weird field. Shiravan looked surprised at Need's words. Iruki's a genius? Suddenly, loud voices from the crowd echoed, hey look, it's Iruki. Why is he heading into the shadowy area again? Ahead, Iruki was on a platform, walking toward a certain direction. People below were staring at him, and a teasing voice called out, come on, he's not going to strip and lie down there, right? Shiravan was stunned, wondering to himself, strip? Need, standing next to him, slapped his forehead and shouted in panic, oh no, what's he planning to do now? Let's go check it out. At that moment, on the high platform, a whirlwind of air started to swirl around Iruki's legs and some kind of magical circle appeared around him. Then, from where he stood, powerful energy began to radiate outward. The magical circle spun around his feet, and he stood confidently, one hand in his pocket, watching as a stream of green energy shot up from the ground into the sky. Shiravan and the others stood frozen, mouths agape, staring at the surge of green energy. He wondered, what is that? Then, another thought crossed his mind. Redirecting spiritual energy, that speed is incredible. The green energy now formed a massive swirling vortex above the heads of the other students. Some of them looked visibly terrified. Suddenly a voice echoed, no matter how many times I see this, it never stops being mesmerizing. Another voice followed, I doubt anyone else in this kingdom could pull off something like that. Iruki smirked and snapped his fingers. Without warning, 8 medium-sized green circles appeared on the ceiling. The others looked up, murmuring in confusion. What is that? Some kind of target? The teacher, who had been in the middle of a lesson for Class 4, turned around at the commotion. She gasped in shock before shouting, Iruki, stop this right now. Above them, the green circles suddenly sprouted 2 small wings and began moving. Inside each one, a rotating ring formed, resembling an eerie, unblinking eye. With his fingers pressed together, Iruki's cold blue-green eyes gleamed as he uttered, Ignite. A warning cry rang out. Everyone, get out of the way. Panic erupted. Students scrambled in every direction, shouting, that lunatic. In the chaos, no one noticed that one of the eerie green eyes had been pierced by a sword. It began to glow intensely on the ceiling, sending another wave of terror through the crowd. Then suddenly it exploded, a loud, thunderous blast right above everyone's heads, sending them into complete panic, with a flash of bright purple smoke. Everyone screamed, their voices almost giving out. Shirin didn't run. Instead, he stood there frozen, not caring that the purple smoke was blowing his hair around. Then Iruki's laughter echoed. He spoke while glancing sideways at Shiravan, hand raised to eye level. See you later, Shiravan. Iruki disappeared into the swirling purple and white smoke. The teacher suddenly grabbed him by the ear, furious, yelling and dragging Iruki away. You troublemaker. It's only been a short time since the last incident, and you're causing trouble again. Iruki winced from the pain, but still managed to reply. I can destroy the machine, though. I know you didn't. The teacher, seeing that Iruki had spoken, shouted louder. Ha! You're suspended for 3 days, got it? Iruki didn't seem surprised. It was as if he'd been through this a lot before, casually responding. 3 days? That's it. Then someone's voice continued, talking about Iruki. Iruki is the oddest student in Class 5. His current image is one of high class and unapproachable. He sits with his legs crossed on the desk, hands behind his head, looking straight ahead. The voice continued, his social skills are extremely low, and his character is probably average. But the reason Iruki is called a genius is because he specializes in just one thing. For his midterm exams, he scored 0 in every social studies subject but got perfect scores in all of his science subjects. There's a condition called Savant syndrome. Savant syndrome is a phenomenon where, after recovering from brain damage, patients may develop abilities far beyond what most people are capable of. That strange voice kept echoing. To be specific, Iruki is the king of all sciences. His nervous system lights up with neurons. The person went on to explain, for example, he can calculate what will happen in extreme environments, whether the temperature is below freezing or above 100 degrees. He could even figure out the date 40,000 years from now. If he really wanted to, I bet he could memorize the digits of pi for his entire life. However, when it came to other areas, the statement stopped right there. Then the literature professor became so angry that the veins on his face stood out. He held up the test paper and shouted, Iruki, are you disrespecting the authority of the professor? It's ridiculous that you turned an essay into a math problem. Specifically, in the second question, you were asked to explain the meaning of the line, the leaves tremble and fall, from the poem by Gilberto. But you answered that the velocity on the surface of the falling leaf has air resistance, so it moves according to the resultant force vector. You've even written out an equation for the leaf's surface model here, and you've solved a whole series of equations in a literature exam. The literature professor slammed his hand down on the desk, furious, and yelled, This is a literature test, not a math test. Meanwhile, Iruki just sat there, looking at his test paper, which the professor had blown up on the big screen. The professor was so angry that she shouted at him, "It seems like you want to prove you're a genius, but there are many things you can't explain with math, like a deep image or emotions." Iruki, looking completely uninterested, scratched his ear with his pinky and said, bored, "But, Professor, there's nothing I can't explain with numbers." He glanced at the professor and continued, "If we can't explain the world with logic, then how can we live in such a terrifying world?" With that, he pointed at the side of his nose, teasing her, and her face looked like it might explode at any moment. Then he crossed his arms, turned his gaze elsewhere, and said, like, for example, an angry face is just a result of a chemical reaction inside your body. The professor stayed silent, glaring at him with pure anger. Iruki went on, emotional imbalance. Your nerves tighten up from all the stress and your blood pressure fluctuates. Then, your blood vessels expand, making your face turn bright red. On the other hand, if they constrict, your veins pop out and turn blue. The professor was furious when she heard this. Her face twisted in such a way that it looked like she was about to explode. Her teeth clenched as she hissed, "Get out." Then the professor's voice echoed throughout the building where he worked. "Get out! You got a 0. 0, 0. Do you understand?" Shiron froze upon hearing it, then exclaimed, "That's incredible. He can speak so confidently about what he believes in." He continued, "I can't believe he's the same age as me. There really are all kinds of people in this world." Sitting across from him, Need rested his chin on his hand, looking conflicted. At first, the professors were very supportive of Iruki, but eventually they all gave up. He crossed his legs, propped his chin on his hand, and said cheerfully, "But who would have thought he'd be curious about you? What a surprise. I was really happy when you approached me first." Shiroan gave a reserved smile. "I understand." Deep down, he still felt a bit uneasy. He raised a hand at his mouth, lost in thought. Anyway, Need sure knows a lot. As he was thinking, a gentle voice spoke beside him. "Excuse me." Both of them flinched and turned to see what was going on. In front of them stood a girl with long hair and a slightly bashful expression. She looked at Shiron and softly asked, "Shiron, would you like to join our research group?" Need, surprised, called out his name, Shiron. But the girl continued her invitation. "We're researching material teleportation magic. If someone as skilled in magic as you joins us, we'll be able to complete the research much faster." She continued, "If you submit the research paper, you won't have to waste your time during the break with performance reviews, and the rest of the time we can study together." Shiron, feeling awkward, spoke up, "Sorry, my current grades aren't that great, so I think I need to focus on that first." He added, "Sorry for turning you down." Hearing that, the girl spoke softly, "Well, we can't really do anything about it. If you change your mind, just let me know." After saying that, she turned and walked back to her group of friends, giving him one last look and saying, "If you change your mind, you can join anytime." Shiron, sitting at the table across, turned around and smiled with squinted eyes. Shiron responded, "All right, thanks." Need smiled back at them with squinted eyes. After a while, they moved to another place, and Need looked back at them, chuckling to herself before saying, "How embarrassing. That research group is pretty impressive." "Well, you got Senior Amy already, so that group probably isn't that special," Sharon said quietly, wondering, what do those two things have to do with each other? Then he shifted his thoughts to something else. Unfortunately, he was still lacking in knowledge. He grew frustrated thinking about his low midterm score. "Just raising my grades is hard enough. I can't even dream about joining a research group." Need teased Sharon, saying, "Ah, you're so jealous." Sharon quickly changed the subject, asking Need, "Don't you have a research group? I think if it were you, you could definitely join a good one." Need cheerfully replied, "Me? I have a research group." Sharon let out a surprised sound before continuing, "And I'm also the group leader." Hearing that, he sighed in disappointment, lowered his head, and sat in silence. Seeing his reaction, Need hurriedly waved his hands, trying to comfort him. No, it's not a big group or anything. You're making me embarrassed. There are only 2 members, so our funding got cut completely." Need then raised his voice, deliberately explaining to Shiron, "All the seniors graduated, so I ended up getting the position." Hearing that, he nodded in understanding and mused, "Graduated students. So past members of the group also went on to graduate?" His eyes suddenly lit up as if realizing something. If a research group had members who successfully graduated, then it must have great potential. Thinking that, Shiron asked, "If you don't mind, can I take a look at your research lab?" Outside the unfamiliar forest, Need's voice rang out, "Shiron, I thought you weren't interested in research." Shiron answered, "No, I am. I just thought I'd be a burden if I joined." Need exclaimed in surprise, "What? A research group isn't that rigid. We study and have fun at the same time. This is our research lab." Need was leading Shiron to his lab, a pitch-dark place with a strange shape. Shiron asked in confusion, What is this? Need introduced, this is called the ISTA storage room, a training facility with all the equipment for the students. The two of them suddenly felt small, almost like ants standing in front of a huge black, cube-shaped research room with a massive gap in the middle, set in an open area of the forest. Need continued, this is a highly advanced storage room. You can place your study materials into a block and it will automatically take them to the room you need. Chiron sighed, clearly frustrated with himself, and said, "Oh, so this is the storage room." Seeing the look on Chiron's face, Need quickly tried to explain. "Wait, hold on. Even though it looks like that, inside it's really secure. You'll be amazed." The two of them entered the lab and Need led the way, introducing it. "This is the valuable place that my seniors have worked hard to protect." Chiron asked, "Really?" He continued, "So I can expect a lot from this, right?" Need immediately answered, "Of course." Then he added, "You'll be amazed by what's inside." Suddenly, an image appeared of someone's hand quickly writing with chalk on a blackboard where the sounds were coming from. As they walked and talked, Need threw his bag over his shoulder, looked at Chiron and smiled. Other brutes had their eyes on this place. My seniors had to fight hard to keep ownership of it. Chiron walked past another hallway, stopped, and asked, "What's this?" Need looked back, grinned, and said, "Actually, we can use everything in here if we want to." Chiron was puzzled and asked, "Isn't that against the rules?" Need looked at him and replied, "Every time you find something you want, the structure of this place changes." In other words, Need paused here. He had already stepped further in, while Chiron had only just entered, following a long yellow line with the number 7 symbol. Need walked ahead, one hand carrying his bag over his shoulder and the other tucked in his pocket. He smirked confidently and said, "No one will be able to find us here." Chiron was amazed as he followed, glancing at him. He was lost in thought, imagining a hideout where no one could find you. Need happily extended his hand ahead, smiling at Chiron. "This is our research lab." Chiron was speechless, his mouth hanging open in surprise. He made a noise full of doubt. The two of them stood in front of an old weathered sign hanging on the door, which read, "Research Lab for Supernatural and Paranormal Phenomena." Chiron suddenly exclaimed in shock, "Science about paranormal phenomena?" Then he paused, thinking it over. Paranormal phenomena in a magic academy. Need, however, was still just as excited as before. He turned to Chiron and asked, "What do you think? It's so cool, right?" Then he continued with an excited tone. "Demons, spirits, past lives, aliens, hell, God, and many other things. We study everything related to topics like that." He stood behind, his face pale and his body shaking uncontrollably. Chiron questioned himself, thinking quietly, "I think I joined the wrong group. I'm not totally uninterested, but this is a bit much." Then a door creaked open, breaking the quiet atmosphere, followed by a loud bang that didn't cause any harm. The force of the explosion blew his hair and clothes around. Chiron gasped, "What was that?" Need, looking amused, squinted and said, "It's just a little dusty. You'll get used to it soon enough." Chiron coughed uncontrollably, covering his mouth with his hand, and shot him a glare, thinking, "Why do I need to get used to it instead of cleaning it up?" He froze once again when he saw something ahead. In front of them was the back of someone standing and writing on a board. It was a rookie, focused on solving something. Chiron spoke up, "Is that a rookie?" Need tilted his head, looked at him, and replied calmly, "Our research team has quite a reputation, so we can't reveal all the members yet. That's why I couldn't tell you about him earlier." Chiron was confused. Was a rookie interested in supernatural phenomena? A rookie seemed to have noticed their presence. Need explained to Chiron that the situation was actually the opposite of what he thought. A rookie had joined to disprove those very things. It was also a good way to challenge people who believed everything in the world could be explained by pure logic. A rookie's eyes lit up with excitement as he called out, "Ah, is that you, Chiron?" He ran over, grabbing both of Chiron's hands, his voice full of enthusiasm. "What kind of wind brings a genius like you to a place like this? It's great that you're here. Listen to what I found out." Chiron was taken aback and hesitated before replying. Then Iruki continued, "What matter is broken down. What remains are atoms, right? That's correct, isn't it?" Still wearing the same excited expression, he went on. "But I think even atoms can be broken down into smaller particles. If that's the case, what do you think those atomic particles are made of?" Shiro was flustered by Iruki's question. He hesitated before speaking. Well, yeah, I'm not sure, but I think there's some kind of hidden latent energy." Hearing that, Iruki enthusiastically shook Chiron's hands up and down. "Exactly. I knew you were incredible. I can't believe you're thinking that far ahead." Chiron broke into a nervous sweat. He thought to himself, "Wait, did I just get that right?" Iruki looked at Chiron happily and continued. "There must be an enormous amount of latent energy, so much that could destroy an entire city. If that's true, what do you think would happen?" Shiron was overwhelmed by Iruki's question. Shocked, he replied, "What?" His face turned serious, and after a brief hesitation, he spoke up, "People are going to get hurt." Hearing that, Iruki casually stuck his pinky into his nose, then coldly responded, "What are you even talking about?" He then extended his pinky outward, his expression now completely unhinged, as if overflowing with untapped energy. "Do you really think we care about that?" Shiron frowned in shock. "What? Do you even hear yourself right now?" Then raising his voice, he continued, "The headmaster told us that as mages, we have to consider the consequences our magic could have on this world." Need, watching the rising tension between them from behind, had no idea how to intervene. Shiron's voice grew even louder. "So you think sacrificing countless people is acceptable just to fulfill your own desires?" Iruki calmly lifted the cherry stem from his glass, his voice indifferent as he remarked, "You're seriously boring, Shiron." Holding the cherry up to eye level, he smirked and went on, "You think other mages don't know this? That they don't do it because they actually care? No, it's because they can't. That's the real reason." Then, popping the cherry into his mouth, he added, "That brilliant mind of yours. It's a gift meant to accomplish something great." Shiron glared at him in frustration and shouted, "It doesn't matter if we're geniuses. Instead of being a genius who brings harm to others, I'd rather be a harmless fool." Iruki was looking up at the sky, chewing on a cherry when he heard Shiron speak. He glanced down and said with a teasing tone, "A small group of geniuses leads the majority of ignorant people. History has proven that, and it's the world we live in. I really hate having to use idealism to explain it." Shiron's expression turned serious. He shot a glare at Iruki and snapped, "No, your logic smells like failure. You could easily satisfy that ideal, though." Need rushed in, sweating profusely, and waved both hands in the air to break the tense atmosphere. "Well, that discussion was really interesting, huh?" Shiron stood there, staring hard at Iruki, who was still standing with his arms crossed and looking away. Shiron rubbed the tip of his nose, and Need quietly stepped in to calm things down. "But you know, getting emotionally worked up like this isn't good for you, right? Come on, sit down, have a bite of cake, drink some water." Shiron realized he couldn't stay any longer. Without a word, he turned and headed straight for the door, saying, "I've got nothing else to say here." "Goodbye, Need. I'm leaving." Need cried out, waving his hands at Shiron as he walked away. "Wait, Shiron, do you know the way out?" Iruki casually asked while rubbing his nose. "Just follow the same path you came in through. If you can't manage that, then you're really a fool." Need turned around, anger flaring, and shouted, "Hey, why'd you say that? If it were you, you could have explained it in a way he'd understand, right?" Iruki slumped down onto the couch and responded, "Well, I admit, I did go a bit overboard." Then he crossed his arms, placed his right leg on his thigh, and smirked. "It's because he's my rival." Need looked at him with a puzzled expression and said, "You're doing this on purpose, aren't you? And who would have guessed you'd actually use the word rival, when all you ever care about in this world is numbers?" Iruki ran his fingers through his hair, leaning his head back and looking at Need with an air of arrogance. He replied, "Exactly, that's exactly why all I care about is numbers. You saw Shiron in the ranking test, right?" Need, surprised, responded, "The teleportation test? Of course I remember. And that's how he ended up being ranked the same as us." Iruki glanced up at the ceiling, thinking for a moment, and then continued, "For someone who's just learned teleportation, do you have any idea how fast you have to think to get past level 10, especially the Dragon's Labyrinth?" Need stayed silent, his face tense as he stared at Iruki. Iruki, still deep in thought, added, "There's no way to get through it without dividing your time." In that moment, he was performing 10,000 calculations per second. Iruki's voice grew serious as he said this. Shiron's brain worked quickly, connecting to the concepts appearing in Iruki's mind. Need, upon hearing this, was immediately surprised and spoke up, 10,000 calculations per second, really?" Iruki suddenly lowered his head, then burst into mad laughter, exclaiming loudly, "That's the mystery of wisdom. Faster than effort, more accurate than knowledge. No conscious calculation can ever beat the speed of the unconscious mind's processing." Afterward, he suddenly became calm again, staring at Need with a cold, sharp look before saying, "What about you, Need? What would you do?" Need furrowed his brows for a moment at Iruki's question, then smirked, showing his teeth as he replied, "I get it now. A battle between calculation and wisdom, and you want to test that with an exam, right?" The upcoming test was on his mind as he spoke, and he couldn't help but think of Shiron's determined expression as he left earlier. The next day, voices of conversation echoed outside the grand building where the students were. "The speed test is happening in 2 weeks, right? If I get another failing grade, I won't be able to level up." Inside the classroom where these conversations were coming from, it seemed that class had just ended. Shiron was packing his bag at his desk when he overheard the chatter. "But aren't you looking forward to it?" "What?" They suddenly mentioned Shiron. Shiron. Hearing his name, he stopped packing his bag. The voice continued, he's really good at the practical part, right? I wonder how high his score is going to be. He overheard them talking and couldn't help but feel anxious inside. He thought to himself, the rapid fire test. In the rapid fire test, you use active magic to aim at targets and score points accordingly. Active magic is the common term for spells that affect targets other than the caster. Even those who aren't part of the attack, healing, or support classes can participate in this test. You need to hit all the targets that appear in each round to move on to the next. There are 3 rounds in total, numbered 1, 2, and 3, with a number of targets being 10, 11, and 12, respectively. Fast and accurate aiming is crucial. However, Shiron was sitting still in his chair, holding a cup of tea with both hands. He was both amazed and worried, so he spoke up. Professor, I still can't control active magic. If that's the case, how can I take the rapid fire test? The professor responded, saying, to be able to use all level magic, you need to score at least 60 points. A score sheet appeared showing 4 numbers, 41, 40, 41, 42. Sina Oliver, the homeroom teacher of class 5 and Shiron's professor, sat in her chair, holding a cup of tea, smiling with her eyes squinted. She said to him, but it seems like your chemistry score in the class I teach is increasing the fastest. Pretty impressive, huh? He called out to her, pleading. Professor, from the window, you could see into her office. The two of them were sitting across from each other. Sana was wholeheartedly encouraging him. I'm not teasing you. You completely understand this subject. You can fully optimize and apply all your knowledge. Shiron sat with a slight hunch, feeling a bit awkward as he listened to her continue. And there's one more thing, right? A part of this knowledge that only an expert could truly grasp. He was surprised to hear her say that. Then a thought struck him. Wait, are you talking about the photon decomposition theory? Then another realization hit him. Teleportation magic is actually a variation of photon decomposition theory. It's a type of passive magic that breaks down the user's body into photon particles. He recalled what had happened before. The process had been so fast that he hadn't even noticed it was passive magic. So it turns out it wasn't something too advanced for him after all. Passive magic doesn't have a time limit for the mage. As he finished reminiscing, Shiron looked at Sana in astonishment and spoke up. I didn't know we could apply photon decomposition theory to active magic. She turned to search for something while saying, recently, magic like this has been getting registered at the association. He was taken aback, wondering to himself, magic that uses photons. I hope it looks cool. The image of Amy, shining brilliantly while using her domain, flashed through his mind. Sana handed him a document. Take a look. Shiron held it in his hands and thought to himself, this is his first active spell. He thought for a moment, then flipped through the pages of his magic journal. He came across a page with important information, a new discovery about photon splitting theory and photon output. Beneath the image, there were additional notes. The researcher described photon output as being similar to its name. This was magic that produced light as its output. A person could detect everyone around them through photon output. However, this method wasn't as effective as light magic, and a lot more research was needed to understand it fully. He then voiced his concern. Professor Shiron picked up the book, widened her eyes, and said, are you sure this is the spell you're introducing to me? You can take the test, but I'm not sure you'll be able to use this magic effectively. She lifted her teacup, closed her eyes, and gently replied, on the surface, it seems pretty useless, but the idea of using photon output is incredibly bright. She sipped her tea and continued, light is the fastest thing in this world. A golden beam of light in the shape of a Z flashed through her mind, and linear paths are easy to control. In the Ivory Tower, the leading institution in magical efficiency, they had predicted that photon output would be a major breakthrough for information transmission and communication in the future. A towering spire faintly appeared behind a veil of white clouds. Sina mentioned that it was already being studied in many magical techniques we don't even know about yet. If they study it more thoroughly and consistently, it could develop into a highly advanced field of magic by the time you graduate, with enormous potential. After she finished speaking, Shiron looked at the book, propped his chin up with his hand, and thought for a moment before replying to Sina, I understand. It wouldn't be bad if I could master this skill before that happens. I'll do as you say, Professor. Magic leading to a new field, huh? He thought. Maybe it'll turn out to be something pretty interesting to learn. Now, Shiron was in a different space, standing in a forest. He raised one hand into the air, but nothing happened. Surprised, he muttered to himself, raising both hands in front of him, waving them up and down. Why isn't it working? One hand was holding the document Sina had given him, and with the other, he raised his palm, staring at it. He spoke out loud in disbelief. No way, I can't control it at this level yet. It turned out he was in a training area with other students. In Training Area 32, a large, open space at the foot of a mountain surrounded by trees and hills. Close to the edge, there was a large viewing platform, with students gathered around it. These were students from the 5th year practical class. Someone raised their hand into the air and silently whispered, "Activate the spell." Activating the spell was the gesture used to cast magic. Then he thought for a moment. Of course, the magic doesn't come from the hands, but from the spirit domain. However, imagining the photon coming from my hands makes it easier for me to cast spells. He raised both hands, looking at them nervously, and kept thinking. Creating photons isn't simple. Could it be because my spirit domain is the type that gathers energy? It's kind of like casting a spell. Suddenly, a woman's voice rang out. "Nice to meet you all. I'm Athela." She stepped out onto the stage, smiling with her eyes squinted, and said, "Let's get started with today's lesson." The students standing on the field were in a panic, all gasping and shouting together. "Who are you?" Professor Athela's glasses were gone. It was true. She had taken them off and was clapping her hands together, smiling gently as she looked at them. Chiron exclaimed in awe, "Oh my gosh, your outfit is gorgeous." A male student behind him touched his upper lip with his finger, closing his eyes as he guessed. She must have just come back from training. Chiron turned to look at him, confused. "Training? When? Where?" The male student continued answering. "That's right. Professor Athela is a bishop of the Karsus order." Chiron looked at him skeptically. "A bishop? You mean she's a pastor?" Another male student standing behind added, "Exactly. A bishop is a high-ranking position that protects the 12 holy temples." He explained that there are 12 bishops across the entire continent. Athela shone in her bishop attire, surrounded by a halo not everyone can achieve. The voice of the male student continued, "And Professor Athela is one of them. With her strong mental power, she was granted the title Jonah by the kingdom. Jonah is the title given to the wizard with the strongest willpower." Once the student finished speaking, he proudly turned towards the arena and asked, "Got it now?" With that confident exterior, Professor Athela. Immediately, the word "obsessed" appeared above Mead's head. He gazed at Athela with adoration, clasped his hands together, and said with deep admiration, "From today on, I'm joining Professor Athela's team." Then he put his hands to his face, twisting his body dramatically as he spoke with dreamy eyes. "I will study hard, I'll study forever, and I'll pass the test forever." The two male students watching were left speechless. Chiron, on the other hand, was silent, staring off into the distance, deep in thought. Amazing, he thought to himself. I can't believe I'll be learning magic from such a talented professor. Athela, standing happily in the arena, clasped her hands and loudly asked, "Are you all ready for the speed shooting test?" The crowd in front of her responded in unison, yes. She smiled and continued, "Before the test, each class will have a practical lesson like today's." They eagerly responded together, yes. With a serious stance but still smiling, Athela announced, "In today's lesson, we'll be learning an advanced technique to enhance your versatility. I've invited a senior from the graduation class to help us out." The students began to murmur excitedly, "Oh, from the graduation class? Where? Where?" Athela's voice rang out warmly. "Please welcome Mage Samuel Kodadama." Footnote: Koto means words and Dama means soul or spirit. Samuel relaxed his shoulders and stepped forward, greeting the class. "Hello, 5th year students." He placed a hand on his shoulder, bowed his head to everyone, and said, "At the invitation of our esteemed Professor Athela, I've come here today. Even though this isn't exactly my place, I hope I can be of some help to you all. I'm more than happy to do so." The female students let out excited murmurs, unable to hide their enthusiasm. Meanwhile, as Samuel bowed slightly beside her, Athela clasped her hands in front of her chest and instructed, "Samuel's signature magic is Kokodama, which is closely related to today's lesson. So please pay attention and stay focused, everyone." The two male students who had stood in front of Chiron and Mead earlier looked visibly jealous. The one on the left scoffed, "A graduate's disguise." The one on the right clenched his fists, gritting his teeth as he muttered, "He's not even on our level." Standing behind them, Mead and Chiron both wore expressions of disdain. Mead smirked and said, "Since when was he ever on your level?" Standing on the platform, Samuel looked down at the students gathered below and raised his voice. Kokodama magic uses the power of words to amplify mana. Seeing it for yourselves will be much easier to understand than any explanation I could give. He extended both hands forward, his blue eyes lifting slightly as he spoke. "So first, I'll show you a basic Dragon Fist wind spell." He used the magic field created from the palm of his hand, a stream of green air that swirled around like a ball. Chiron was surprised and thought, "Oh my, that spell is something the principal showed me when I was little." Then Samuel exclaimed, "Dragon Spiral Wind." Immediately, out of nowhere, a high tornado swept through, lifting everyone's hair, and the center of the vortex was right where he stood. After a while, the storm began to settle. Everyone was frightened and whispered, "You really scared me there." That was no joke. Samuel calmly closed his eyes, holding the notebook in his hand, and continued. Remember the power of that spell. Now I will amplify its magic with Kodadama. He then spoke a chant, Earth Mother, Wild Demon. After that, Samuel opened his blue eyes and, looking down at the small notebook in his hand, read aloud, I call upon your strength. Please take my hand. From the heavens above, spanning through eternity, the sacred temple, my heart holds. The soul of the mage merges with the earth and sky, singing a high melody. To honor and praise, let it burn and contribute the wind to create a storm. At this point, everyone was amazed by his chanting. The female student looked at him with admiration and murmured, It sounds like a spell. His voice is so beautiful. 3 minutes later, he was still reading his chant, the soul united with the body. We call upon the name of the sorcerer, fearless of the wild power of the mighty lion, along with the ocean that holds the burning sunlight and the earth that carries the wind blowing for millions of years. We will devote ourselves without limit, moving toward utmost reverence. Everyone had dozed off after hearing the chant for just 3 minutes. A few others, clearly tired, spoke up. How much longer is this going to take? Don't fall asleep. He looked serious, the corners of his eyes narrowing as he said, Long Quan Feng. Right after, a whirlwind erupted from his feet, spiraling straight up into the sky. Its force was so powerful that it almost sent everyone flying, including Chiron. Others screamed in panic, Help me! Everyone was tossed around by the pull of the vortex. It felt like they were just strands of hair swaying in the wind. They exclaimed, I thought we were going to get blown away for good. Athela smiled with her eyes squinted and spoke up. She didn't say the chant out loud, but she still recited it in her mind. Samuel's voice carried his will into every word, holding them precious. The small book contained many different spells. He continued, This is what has amplified the magic power. This is the fundamental principle of Kodadama magic. Samuel held the small book, closed his eyes, and calmly said, However, the spell is too long to use in battle, so now I'll show you something called the sound speed magic. The others panicked when they heard him. Not more? They exclaimed. But Samuel didn't continue reading. He simply folded the small book shut with his thumb and index finger, then quietly said, Earth Mother's Fury. He then tilted his head back and shouted toward the sky, Grant this to me. What followed was a series of rapid, long incantations, so fast that no one could fully make out the words. The wave grew stronger with every passing moment, and their hair seemed as if it would fly off their heads. Samuel didn't stop chanting, his tongue moving up and down so quickly that it was hard to tell what he was saying. One hand held the book, while the other was raised toward the sky as he shouted something incomprehensible. His hair whipped wildly in the fierce wind. His blue eyes seemed ready to pop out, blood vessels visible in his sclera. He screamed, Dragon's Windstorm. After those 3 words, the wind rising from the ground shot straight up into the sky. Even from miles away, you could see it. It formed a massive pillar of wind, surrounded by a swirling vortex that tore through the thick forest, blowing away the trees in its path. Athela's voice suddenly rang out, All right, you all saw the senior demonstrate, right? No one answered because they were all knocked to the ground by her long Quian Fong technique, scattered across the floor. Chiron pushed himself up with one hand on the ground, while brushing his hair with the other. His eyes half closed, he thought to himself, That power is unbelievable. Is this the level of a graduation class mage? He kept thinking. A graduate level mage, referred to as a level 10 mage, was technically not considered an official mage. Athela stood with her hands clasped, turned, and cheerfully looked at him, saying with a smile, Thanks, Samuel. He bowed his head in reply, Anytime, just let me know. Chiron watched them, lost in thought. I can't even imagine how much more powerful someone like her, a level 6 official mage, could be. So this is what the world is really like. Some of the students had managed to sit up, while others were still lying on the ground. One student over there, trembling, raised their hand and asked, Professor, do we need to practice Kodadama magic? She stood on the platform, looked down, and answered, Kodadama magic is an advanced subject, so you won't need to practice it. Hearing that, they all breathed a sigh of relief. Then her tone became serious as she continued. Instead, the technique you'll be practicing is called trajectory. Trajectory is a technique that will help enhance your versatility by concentrating energy when the time comes. Cheryl raised her hand and asked seriously, So the more we count, the stronger it gets? The other students were left stunned. One male student wondered, Why numbers though, teacher? Athela spoke up to explain, Numbers are characters with specific patterns, so they align with our field. As soon as she finished speaking, her eyes turned blue. A blue field appeared behind her like a glass panel, displaying the words field radius, 10 meters. Athela continued, Of course, you're not just counting. Like Kodadama magic, you're attaching a specific meaning to these numbers. Let me show you. The pattern is the most basic system of propositions used in logic and mathematics. At that moment, Othello was surrounded by a field with a 10-meter radius. She stood inside, squinting her eyes and smiling. I'll activate the field using the trajectory technique. I'll start by counting a series of tens. She closed her eyes and began counting. 100. Suddenly, a 10-meter field expanded beyond its previous limit. The students below began to murmur. Did the professor just count to 100? Did she really just count from 1 to 100? A voice of surprise came from somewhere. The professor's field has expanded. The 10-meter field had indeed expanded to 12 meters. Then, Othello continued counting. 400, 1100. With each number, the field kept growing. She reached 1700. Then it reached 2400. Chiron was stunned and quickly covered his face with his hands, thinking to himself, no way, how could an ordinary person be this fast? The range of his aura continued to expand, and he kept thinking about how easy it was. He stared in surprise. After she counted to 10,000, she opened her eyes and let out a relieved sigh. The aura now covered almost half of their training ground, and everyone around them exclaimed, it must be just the trajectory technique, but the aura has quadrupled in power. Othello stood on the platform, looking down at the students who were staring in awe with their mouths open. She spoke up, did you all pay attention? If Kodadoma magic reflects and sets up the scene, it likely only uses thought and reflection. She added, the faster you count, the stronger your aura will become. Not only will its size expand, but its power will also increase. The precision and accuracy were clear, a spiral of numbers twisted down from above. She continued, and all your skills will be enhanced. He stood there, dazed, thinking to himself, this is amazing. If I master this technique, I could generate photons. Othello's voice echoed on, of course, trajectory is not all-powerful. Its effects will weaken if your mental strength isn't stable enough. She cheerfully reminded them, so don't forget that strict discipline and a will full of empathy are the basic principles when unlocking your aura. Understand? Everyone replied in unison, yes. A moment later, they all split up to practice. Chiron stood there, lost in thought, then clenched his fist and nodded happily to himself. All right, I counted to 1,000 in 1 minute. Then he thought, but counting silently is harder than I thought. In fact, everyone around me couldn't stay focused when counting for too long. Seeing this, he reflected, if I hadn't been constantly training my mental strength in class, I definitely wouldn't have been able to do it. Suddenly, he remembered something. Wait a minute, when I teleported, I used a technique to help me process complex calculations. He guessed that it was probably trajectory. A series of large and small numbers appeared in his mind. He continued thinking, sorting the numbers by hundreds and stacking them together. A beam of light struck the ground and shone brightly. Chiron estimated it had been about 10 seconds. Then, with a serious look, he held out his palm, silently wondering if he should aim at the tree. He mentally repeated the word Fet Kwang Tu, and suddenly his palm began to glow. The yellow light twisted into spirals and shot straight toward the tree, surprising everyone. The light shot straight toward the tree over there. Everyone gasped, exclaiming, what? What's that? What's that light? The students behind him were wide-eyed, mouths agape. Chiron was also startled, but kept his posture. He silently exclaimed in his mind, so dazzling. After performing the technique, Chiron stood still deep in thought. It's so flashy. From above, looking down at the large practice field, he noticed he was still standing in place while people gathered in small groups, turning their heads to look at him. Their murmurs filled the air. Was that Fet Kwang Tu? Did he learn that for the rapid-fire test? Since it's light, it's definitely fast. One of the students hesitated and said, but learning this just for a test seems a bit... Another voice replied, yeah, it's not really practical, is it? Othello, who was standing outside, turned around and accidentally saw him casting his radiant spell. She looked a bit confused, thinking to herself, ha, Chiron, the defensive specialist, is now learning offensive magic. She walked over and called out to him, Chiron, looks like you've mastered trajectory right. He turned to her, surprised, and said, Professor. Then he quickly turned away, sounding a bit awkward. Yeah, I guess so. Othello cheerfully suggested, would you like to try practicing in the projection field? Now, everyone gathered around the projection field, where a figure stood in the center. They started discussing among themselves. Oh, are we jumping straight into speed shooting? I'm so curious. Othello stood behind a desk, watching him and instructed, after you finish with trajectory, summon the target, okay? Chiron glanced back and nodded, yes. Once he replied, he closed his eyes, focusing. He first used trajectory to enhance his magical field. Numbers of various sizes gathered into a large point of light, then split into smaller points of light, all concentrating around him. Chiron stood straight, then snapped his fingers. The projection field began to activate, surrounding him. He thought to himself and summoned his target. Immediately, a series of blue lights appeared around Chiron. On the dark green screen, the information appeared. Rapid fire level 01, score 00. The time limit was 1 minute. Shiron's pupils flashed as he quickly identified the targets and reflexively reacted to the dazzling blue light. He frowned and widened his eyes, watching as the targets hovered in front of him. Then he raised his hand, focusing his energy to concentrate in one spot. He directed his palm toward the target floating in midair, then focused, mentally activating the photon. At once, the photon emitted a glow and shot straight toward the target. Shiron watched in awe and thought to himself, "This is exactly what I imagined." He realized that due to the bullet's speed approaching the speed of light, a photon would automatically seek out and hit the target just by a slight release. It shattered the targets into pieces. Shiron kept reflecting on the situation, feeling as if he was both aiming and shooting at the same time. Right now, his rapid fire was at level 02, with a score of 11, and the time remaining was 55 seconds. The other students were astonished, murmuring, "That's incredibly fast." Everyone stared, mouths wide open. One voice rang out repeatedly. As soon as he aimed, he hit the target instantly. It's like a kind of magic that activates immediately. Athela stood there silently, watching him, and thought to herself, "I get it now." Shiron's trajectory is a set of numbers that form a large combination and then expands them. She silently concluded in her mind, "This is a technique once used in magical intelligence." Above Shiron's head, his attack on the targets looked like fireworks exploding in the sky. Below his feet was a wide magic circle that covered the entire field. As Athela observed, she thought that this knowledge must have come from the bridge he couldn't cross. She couldn't help but marvel silently, what an insane rate of growth. Meanwhile, Shiron was focusing on launching attacks at the targets. Not a single shot missed. Every target was shattered into pieces. After a while, the training session with the Phantom Abyss finally came to an end. Shiron stood, wiping the sweat off his forehead with his sleeve, unaware of the information on the wall. The timer showed 19 seconds with a score of 342. Time left, 0 minutes. The crowd below cheered nonstop. Wasn't that a perfect score? 342 targets taken down in just 1 minute. A voice echoed, "Should I switch to using the photon shot instead?" Another voice replied, "You better not. That's only possible if you understand it like Shiron does." As he stood wiping his sweat and exhaled with relief, Shiron thought to himself, "With this move, I don't have to worry about the rapid-fire test anymore." Mead, standing outside, had seen everything unfold. He crossed his arms and spoke up. So far, he hasn't had any success with magic, but as soon as he understood it, he immediately scored 342 points. Impressive, Aruki, who was sitting next to him, commented. "But that's still a pretty careless score." Need quickly responded, "What? But that was his first try." "It's not bad at all." Aruki sat up, glancing at him with a grin. Sure, his score was careless, but it's still interesting. Then Aruki suddenly raised his hand and called out, "Professor Athela, I want to give it a try too." Both Aruki and Need were caught off guard by his words. She looked concerned and spoke up. "Aruki, what are you doing?" She frowned, her voice filled with worry. "Just make sure you don't cause any trouble, all right?" Shiron, who had been standing and wiping his face, suddenly heard a voice that made him stop in his tracks. "Huh? It's Aruki. He wants to try too?" Shiron puffed out his cheeks in frustration, turning his head away as he thought, "Aruki, I really don't like the way he thinks." But then he hesitated and thought, "Still, I'm kind of curious." Aruki stepped out onto the stage, looking confident and determined. Everyone gathered around to watch. He took his hands out of his pockets, stood tall, and smiled slightly. A field of magic started to surround him. The energy rose from beneath his feet and shot up into the sky, and he wore a smug expression. The crowd was stunned, whispering among themselves. Speed shot and a direction shift. No way, that's totally different from speed shot. Shiron was just as surprised. A voice echoed. So he plans to take down the targets just by looking at them. Instead of using synesthesia, the targets slowly floated around Aruki, and a large magical circle appeared beneath his feet. He lowered his head and snapped his fingers. His domain shot straight toward the targets. Shiron frowned in surprise, thinking, is he really shrinking the targets even more? How's he going to do that? Then his eyes widened in realization, and he whispered this. Aruki's domain twisted into a Z shape, cutting through the center of the targets in the sky, leaving everyone below in shock. Suddenly, all the targets exploded at once like fireworks bursting in the air. The crowd gasped, mouths wide open in disbelief. The scoreboard flashed. Speed gun level 02, score 13. Time limit 0:57. Aruki's domain twisted again, cutting through the center of another set of targets, causing them to explode above the crowd. Shiron stood frozen, watching the explosions, already knowing without having to look further that Aruki would easily beat his own score. He thought seriously to himself. Aruki glanced down from above, smirking, and silently thought, if they're already amazed now, they're in for a shock, Shiron. Then he pointed his hand forward, adjusting his domain to move faster and shift into different shapes, triggering the targets to explode. The crowd couldn't help but marvel. Wow, his speeds increased. Has Haruki always been this strong? One of his classmates muttered in awe. Shiron stood behind, his eyes looking up, his hand raised to cover his mouth, a stunned expression on his face. Then he thought to himself, I get it now. If you look closely, you can see that he's not chasing the target with just his eyes. He's predicting the target's movement using motion equations. He glanced at how Haruki was controlling his domain and thought about it. Haruki had divided the targets into different motion equations. Shiron kept thinking, but he was surprised to realize that even after predicting their movements, Haruki was still able to catch up with all the targets using a change of direction. Shiron raised his hand to his chin and said, how is his domain so fast? Could it be that this is also part of trajectory? Need walked closer, smirking, and said, exactly, but Haruki isn't just calculating a few hundred or a few thousand numbers. Shiron asked, clearly puzzled. He's calculating up to hundreds of thousands. Need looked at him and grinned, answering shortly, millions. Shiron's face showed disbelief upon hearing this. The board on the wall displayed the time, level 24 with a score of 548, and the time limit was 0 minutes. Everyone cheered at Haruki's result. What? Haruki is incredible. Haruki, meanwhile, grinned smugly, one hand on his hip and the other raised above his head, looking quite silly. The crowd continued to shout, how come you've been hiding your skills? Hitting a target with such a tiny change of direction is really hard. Are you even human? Othello stood off to the side, watching him walk past before stopping to think for a moment. Amazing, so skillful. He walked up to the edge of the stage and stood in front of Shiron, who was warily eyeing him. Haruki spoke first. So, what do you think? Then he added, is it worth watching? Shiron looked up at him and replied, it's amazing. I didn't know you could use the redirection like that. Haruki, hands in his pockets, smiled arrogantly at Shiron and said, is that all? I'm a little disappointed. Shiron raised an eyebrow, asking, disappointed by what? Haruki answered, I'm honestly impressed that you thought of modulating it that way. Shiron's face fell when he heard this. He then straightened up and looked at Haruki seriously, asking, are you curious about how I managed to calculate millions of numbers? Shiron tensed, eyeing Haruki cautiously. I am, but is it okay for you to tell me? It feels like you see me as a competitor. Everyone around them was watching closely, wondering what they were talking about. Haruki stood on the podium, speaking arrogantly. It doesn't matter. Even if you knew, I'm not sure you could pull it off. Shiron stayed silent, not responding. The crowd was confused, murmuring, what's going on? Haruki's voice rang out again. It's nothing, really. He scratched the back of his head, glanced away, then continued. I use locking and reduce the units. Shiron was stunned when he heard that. He stood there with his mouth open, thinking, no way. How could you consider that a method? The people around them couldn't believe what they were hearing. They gasped. What? Isn't that totally insane? Shiron furrowed his brow, deep in thought. If he calculated things logically, the numbers would definitely seem much bigger. Even if he used trajectory, a simple calculation method, the math would still get complicated. Then, he confidently said, this is the syndrome of a scholar. Haruki raised his finger to his nose, furrowed his brows, and asked, what do you think? Do you think you can beat me? Shiron replied loudly, I'm not trying to beat anyone. This is just a test. Haruki turned his head away, covering his nose, and answered a simple statement from weaklings. Remember that. Then, Haruki became serious. If you don't have the skills, then give up on your ideals and keep pretending to be the best. Shiron sneered, hey, that's not convincing at all. Shiron, growing angry, growled, so if I beat you, that will prove I'm right, right? Haruki snapped his fingers and laughed mysteriously. Of course, but you should know that no matter how much knowledge you have, Haruki continued, compared to me, you're nothing more than a bug. Shiron, completely furious, spat out, a bug? Even Need would be shocked, he thought to himself. Then he eagerly started searching for something in his paper bag. This is really interesting. The rules for the speed shooting test. Your score is based on how many targets you hit within a given time. Level 01, score 00, time limit is 1 minute. For each level, the number of targets increases. In the first stage, the goal is 10 targets. In the second stage, the goal is 11. In the third stage, the goal is 12. In the fourth stage, the goal is 13. And in the fifth stage, the goal is 14. If you miss even one target, you cannot move on to the next level. Additionally, the higher the level, the faster the targets are summoned. If you can't control the field quickly enough to keep up with the targets, you'll time out. If you can't handle them fast enough, you won't be able to summon more targets and your score will take a serious hit. Everyone is focused on the results of the rapid fire test. Shiron is watching too. He thinks to himself, The average score for the 5th grade class is 400. No one has ever scored over 700. Then he rests his chin on his hand, pondering, to reach 700 points, I can't miss a single target. I need to hit level 30 within 1 minute. To do that in 5 seconds, I have to clear 1 level already. At that moment, Sharon stands on the stage with everyone watching him. He looks serious, tilts his head up, and raises his right hand to the sky. Instantly, targets explode one after another. The other students are shocked, looking up at the sky. One of them exclaims, I'm really impressed. This is incredible. He then turns and performs his move. His eyes are sharp and determined. He swings his arm, directing the field toward the targets ahead, and they explode with a thunderous sound on the ceiling. The 2 people who had spoken to Sharon earlier are now standing there, astonished. The one in front speaks up with a serious tone. Sharon is no joke. Now, even without moving his head, he can hit the targets. How could you possibly doubt him earlier? The blackboard on the wall displayed the results. Level 25, score 567, and a time limit of 0 minutes. A voice, filled with admiration, echoed through the room. In just 1 week, his score has jumped by 200 points. The time was up, and the aura disappeared. He stood, massaging his left wrist, letting out a sigh as if releasing all the tension built up from the loud cheers around him. Then, Sharon turned and began to walk away. In the distance, 2 people were whispering to each other. His bullet speed is incredible. Once he locks onto a target, he doesn't miss. The person next to him responded quietly. His rapid-fire shots have improved a lot too. I think he can shoot 4 rounds per second now. Wiping sweat from his face, he glanced back and sighed again, silently thinking to himself, how's that? I've caught up to your score. It turns out he was looking at Aruki behind him. Aruki smirked, standing up leisurely, then walked past Sharon toward the stage. With his hands casually in his pockets, Aruki spoke nonchalantly. My turn. Sharon glanced at him, a little worried. Everyone's attention shifted to the stage, and so did his. He watched it with growing tension. The result was the same as before. Aruki controlled his aura with even more skill, and the wave of energy destroyed the targets, making them explode in unison. Suddenly, someone's voice rang out. His aura is even smaller than before, they said, and Aruki's aura zipped past their heads. Everyone watched in amazement, completely focused on it. The voice continued, and it's even faster now. Aruki's aura continued to twist and weave through the targets, causing them to explode one by one. After a while, Aruki finally finished. He raised his hand, making a gun gesture towards the sky with a cool attitude, then spoke up, Done. The scoreboard on the wall displayed, Time's up. Level 25 score, 568, time limit, 0 minutes. After that, Aruki didn't pay any more attention and walked away without a second glance. The others started talking excitedly again. Aruki's score went up, but it's only 1 point ahead of Sharon's new score, huh? The murmurs grew quieter. Sharon was really close, but he lost. Yeah, but Sharon's score is growing exponentially. He'll catch up soon enough. Meanwhile, Sharon was feeling confused. He watched Aruki's back as he thought that 1 point difference can't be a coincidence. The next day, the scores of both players were just 1 point apart. Of course, Sharon's score was 571 and Aruki's was 572. The following day, the scores were 585 and 586, just a 1 point difference again. The day after that, it was 593 and 594, still just 1 point separating them. Aruki stood with his back to everyone, raised his right hand, glanced back, and smirked proudly. The other students cheered his name. Aruki! Aruki! Only Sharon knew that the 1 point difference wasn't by chance. He stood still among the crowd, glaring up at the podium, deep in thought. So he only wants to be 1 point ahead of me. He must have planned this carefully, starting from level 1. Then, Sharon frowned and stared ahead, deep in thought. That's exactly it. Even though he didn't say it out loud, that was the message he was sending. He imagined Aruki standing on a high wall, looking down at him with arrogance. He could easily defeat someone like him. He stood there, quietly reflecting on that. A little later, in the tall, luxurious building, someone's voice echoed. Do you think Aruki will win this time? It turned out the 3 people were sitting together, talking. One of the guys, sitting on the table with his legs crossed, tilted his head and continued. Scoring over 600 points, Sharon is really good. The person sitting on the left leaned on the table and replied. It's just that Aruki is too strong. Another voice joined in. I think Sharon doesn't know his limits. Meanwhile, Aruki sat with his hand on his cheek, arrogantly looking the other way, not paying attention to the 2 people standing in front of him, who spoke up. Aruki, do you want to join our research group? Teach us how you do it. What's the highest score you can get, Aruki? On the other side, Sharon leaned on the table, clearly irritated, and glared at Aruki. Exactly. Unlike someone who gives it their all like me, Aruki hasn't even used his full abilities. Then he fell silent, thinking that if he hadn't realized this soon, all those strategies would have gone to waste. Suddenly, Need placed a hand on his shoulder from behind, smiling with squinted eyes, and said, "It's okay, we're cheering for you." Then he continued, "Actually, both of you are my friends, so it doesn't really matter who wins." Shiron turned to him, annoyed, and replied, "But at that moment, while eating, I couldn't tell if I was chewing food or my own fate." Nii rested both elbows on the table, slightly tilted his head, and spoke slowly. "I feel sorry for you, but as a spectator, this is actually pretty entertaining. We're also excited to see which one of you can break the high score record." Shiron was puzzled. A high score record that exists? He then asked, "How many points is it? Is it from some senior who graduated?" Neve looked at him blankly and replied, "Don't tell me you don't know the score of your girlfriend." Shiron was surprised and asked back. He turned his head in disbelief. "What?" Neve said loudly, "It's Senior Amy's, 987 points."